Good evening and welcome back. Settle in. Lower the lights if you'd like. There is nothing here you need to do tonight. Only listen and let the world grow quiet around you. Tonight we begin a new journey, north this time, into the cold seas and long winters of the Viking Age. Over these evenings we will follow the dragon ships wherever they went, to the monasteries of England and the rivers of Russia, across the open Atlantic to lands no European had ever seen, and down at last to a single arrow on a September afternoon that ended the whole age. But every age has a first morning. This one begins on a small tidal island off the coast of Northumbria in the early summer of the year 793. A holy island, home to gospel books and saints' bones, and a community of monks whose worst enemy until that morning was the weather. It begins with sails on the horizon, and it begins for everyone watching from the shore, far too late to do anything about it. This is the story of Lindisfarne and of the first fury of the Northmen. To understand what was lost that morning, you have to understand what an island of prayer was doing, wearing a king's ransom in gold. Northumbria, the great kingdom of northern England, had spent the previous century and a half becoming one of the brightest corners of Europe. Its monasteries were not humble hermitages. They were the universities, libraries, art schools, and treasure houses of their world. At Jarrow, a monk named Bede had written the first great history of the English people, working through some 600 books in his library at a time when a single book cost a herd of cattle. And on Lindisfarne, Holy Island, joined to the coast twice a day by a causeway of wet sand, monks had made one of the most beautiful objects human hands have ever produced. The Lindisfarne Gospels, page after page of interlaced colour, 10,000 decisions of the pen without one visible mistake. St. Cuthbert himself is worth a moment, because his gentleness is the measure of the place. A shepherd boy turned monk turned reluctant bishop. He had ended his life as a hermit on a bare rock further out to sea, praying through the nights while, the stories say, otters warmed his feet, and make him one of history's first recorded bird protection rules for the eider ducks that still nest on those islands and are still called Cuddy's ducks, Cuthbert's ducks, today. When his coffin was opened 11 years after his death, the monks found him, so they testified, and so the North believed, perfectly incorrupt, as if asleep. From that moment, Lindisfarne was not merely a monastery. It was the resting place of a living saint and the luckiest, holiest ground in Britain. Lindisfarne was the heart of the North's holiness, and the saint's shrine made it rich. Pilgrims came with gifts, and kings came with grants of land, and the altars gathered a century of silver chalices, golden crosses, jewelled book covers, and embroidered silks, all of it guarded by nothing. Prayer, reputation, the universal understanding of Christian Europe that no one, no matter how violent the age, and it was a violent age, laid hands on the property of God. Daily life there was patient, communal, and quietly industrious. Beyond the church stood the workshops that made the island famous, the scriptorium where the great Gospels had been written, a labour, scholars reckon, of years on vellum that had required the skins of well over 100 calves, the school where boys given to the monastery learned their letters, barns, brewhouse, guest hall for pilgrims. There were no walls worth the name. The community's founders had chosen a tidal island precisely because the sea was their protection. Twice a day, God drew up the drawbridge. The monks kept the hours, from the dark of matins to the candlelight of Compline. The tide came in and went out, and that universal understanding held, right up until the moment it met people who had never subscribed to it. And there had been, for those who later remembered it, one small dress rehearsal that nobody understood at the time. A few years earlier, 3 strange ships had put in on the south coast at Portland. The King's Reeve, a conscientious official named Bygone, rode down to meet them, assuming they were traders who ought to be escorted to the royal manor to pay their dues. He spoke to them in the language of rules and tolls. They killed him on the beach. The chronicler noted it as a puzzling outrage. Only in hindsight did England understand it had met its future. If the monks' world felt secure, the kingdom around them did not. Northumbria's golden age was tarnishing fast. In the very years before the raid, one king had been deposed, another murdered by his own household, a third, Ethelred, restored to a throne he had already lost once, and busy killing potential rivals. Alcuin's furious letters home name it all: perjury, murder among princes, luxury at the top and hunger below. When he came to explain the catastrophe at Lindisfarne, he did not reach far for a cause. A kingdom that ate itself, he warned, should not be surprised when the wolves came to the fold. Modern historians prefer winds and silver to divine judgment. But on the simple point that Northumbria was distracted and divided at exactly the wrong moment, the old scholar was not wrong. There had been omens that year, or so it seemed afterward, when men searched their memories for warning. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records them with a shudder you can still feel through the centuries. Immense whirlwinds and lightning storms over Northumbria, and fiery dragons seen flying in the air. A great famine followed, and then, says the Chronicle, in one of the most quietly devastating sentences in English history, a little after that, in the same year, the harrying of the heathen miserably destroyed God's church in Lindisfarne by rapine and slaughter. It was the 8th of June, early summer, when the North Sea is at its gentlest and a passage from the fjords is fast sailing. That detail matters, and no one on the island knew enough to fear it yet. From now on, for 2.5 centuries, good sailing weather itself would mean danger. The English would learn to pray in words that may echo a real litany of the age. From the fury of the Northmen, good Lord, deliver us. Consider too what the two sides carried that morning. A Norse warband came ashore in mail or leather, with round shields, bearded axes, swords whose making was the finest metallurgy in Northern Europe. Men trained from boyhood in exactly this kind of fighting. Against them, monks. The rule of the community forbade weapons. The strongest thing on the island was a fisherman's boat hook. Every raid in this opening generation had that same terrible arithmetic, and the raiders knew it. That was the point. The plan did not require a battle. It required only a beach and speed. Reconstruct the morning as nearly as the evidence allows. Low water or near it. The raiders knew the tides or read them at a glance, and a beaching is best done on a making tide that will float you off again. The island's day already hours old. Bread baked, the young boys at their letters. Brothers in the fields, the community farmed on the mainland shore. The older monks at work over vellum in the north light. Perhaps the bell going for one of the lesser hours. The bell that called to prayer, and that would, in the years ahead, become all along these coasts an alarm signal instead. The sea bright to the east, and on it, where there had been nothing, sails. We do not know who saw the sails first. Ships were not strange. Traders came up the coast all summer. What was strange came later and fast. The ships not standing off in the roadstead, but driving straight for the beach. The way no cargo vessel ever behaved, the keels sliding up onto the sand at speed, and men coming over the bows into the shallows, dozens of them, armed, moving with terrible purpose toward the church. What followed was recorded a generation later by the chronicler Simeon of Durham, drawing on the memories of the community. The raiders, he wrote, laid everything waste with grievous plundering. They dug up the altars, dug them up, hunting the relics and treasures beneath. They seized every ornament of the holy church. Some of the brothers they killed outright. Some they carried off in fetters, bound for the slave markets of the north. Some they drove out naked and insulted, and some, he says, they drowned in the sea. There is no way to soften that mourning, and we will not try. Men who had taken vows of peace, who owned nothing, whose days were bread and prayer and copying work, met men for whom a monastery was precisely what it appeared to be. An unguarded warehouse with a bell tower. It was over in hours. The ships went back down the beach on the tide, heavier than they came, and the survivors were left with their dead, their broken altars, and the news which would travel further and hit harder than any raid. What the survivors did next says everything about them. They stayed. Bishop Higbold and the remnant of his community buried their dead, repaired what could be repaired, and took up the hours again, matins in the dark, the psalms in their courses. On the same sand where the keels had grounded, the shrine of Cuthbert was intact. The saint, they told themselves, had protected his own body, if not his boys. Pilgrims kept coming. The island school reopened. It is one of the age's quiet, stubborn heroisms, easy to miss beside the axes. The people who simply carried on the front line for decades. Because the alternative was to concede that the sea belonged to the raiders. Because Lindisfarne was not just any monastery. Striking it was like striking a cathedral, a royal tomb and a national library at once. Across Europe, wherever the faith reached, men felt the shock of it, felt for the first time in living memory that the sea itself had turned hostile, and that nothing sacred was safe anywhere within sound of the surf. We can measure that shock precisely because one of the most famous men in Europe happened to be a Northumbrian abroad, and he put his grief in writing. Alcuin of York was the greatest scholar of his generation, headhunted years before by Charlemagne himself to run the palace school of the Frankish Empire. When word of Lindisfarne reached him, he wrote home, to the King of Northumbria, to the bishop, to the surviving brothers. Letters that still exist and still tremble. It is nearly 350 years, he wrote, that we and our fathers have inhabited this most lovely land, and never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Nor was it thought possible, he said, that such an inroad from the sea could be made. There is the whole age in one sentence of a stunned scholar. It was not thought possible. Europe's defences, such as they were, all faced inland. Walls against neighbouring kingdoms. Hosts levied against armies that marched by road and announced themselves. Nobody had built anything against an enemy who arrived out of the empty horizon at rowing speed, struck within the hour, and was gone before any lord could saddle a horse. It is worth knowing who was writing those letters to feel their weight. Alcuin ran what amounted to the intellectual headquarters of Western Europe, Charlemagne's palace school at Aachen, and stood as close to the most powerful man in Christendom as any scholar has ever stood to power. When he wrote that the blood of saints had been poured out around the altar where he himself had prayed as a boy, all of literate Europe read it over his shoulder. The raid on one small island became, through his pen, the whole civilization's news story, the 9th century equivalent of footage on every screen. On the island itself, the survivors gathered around their Bishop Higbald to count what was left. It is to Higbald and his brothers that Alcuin's tenderest letter went, comfort first, scolding after, and in it one line of pure practicality that historians treasure. If the return of the captive boys could be arranged, he wrote, he would gladly help see to it, whether by appeal or by ransom. Somewhere behind that sentence lies the age's grim ordinary machinery. Messengers, brokers, weighed silver, by which at least some of Lindisfarne's stolen children may have come home. We do not know if they did. The letters are all that survive. Alcuin, being a churchman of his age, also reached for the explanation his world required. Such a calamity must be punishment. For luxury, for thin devotion, for fine clothes and foreign fashions. He scolded the survivors even as he comforted them, and begged his king to consider the state of the kingdom's soul. We may read it differently now, but notice what his letters do not do. They do not treat the raiders as the end of the world. He wrote practical letters too, about ransoming the boys carried off, about restoring the community. Europe's first reaction to the Vikings, in other words, was the full human range, horror, theology, and negotiation. So who were they, the men in the shallows? Set aside, for a moment, everything the word Viking carries. They came from the lands we now call Norway, Denmark and Sweden, a world of long coastlines and short summers, of scattered farms on fjord sides and islands, where the sea was not a barrier but the only road there was. They were farmers, fishers, boat builders, traders, societies of free landholders under local chieftains, rich in timber, iron, furs and seamanship, and chronically short of two things, good farmland and silver. And they had, quite recently, perfected the finest seagoing technology on the planet. How they found their way deserves a word, because they did it with nothing we would call an instrument. No compass, no chart, no astrolabe. The tools of our Age of Exploration series were centuries away and a world to the south. A Norse skipper carried the route in his head as a chain of knowledge. So many days sail on this bearing, keeping the pole star at that height above the horizon at night, the sun there at noon. Watch for the sea to change colour where the currents meet. The birds will tell you. A fulmar means open ocean. A gannet means land within flying distance. On a clear day, you will raise the ice blink of the mountains before the mountains themselves. Sailing directions of exactly this kind were still being recited in Iceland centuries later, word for word, like poems. It was navigation as memory, and it took them, in time, to the edge of the known world and past it. A ship's crew, it is worth understanding, was not a military unit, but something warmer and older. A felag, a fellowship, literally a laying together of property. Neighbours and cousins pooled silver to fit out a ship, swore loyalty for the voyage and shared the takings by agreed portions, with lawsuits waiting at home for captains who cheated. 30 or 60 men who had grown up within a day's walk of one another, whose fathers had rowed together under a leader they had chosen and could desert. It made every longship crew fast, flexible and very hard to frighten, an armed village afloat. And it meant the Viking Age was, among everything else, history's most successful joint stock venture before the invention of the joint stock company. The strangest part is how new their mastery was. The sail reached Scandinavia astonishingly late. The northern ships of Roman times were rowed, and only in the century or so before Lindisfarne did the Norse marry the sail to their light, flexible hulls and deep keels. When the marriage happened, it changed what the sea meant. Voyages that had taken weeks of coast-hugging rowing became days of open water sailing, and a people who had always been good boatmen became, within a few generations, the best deep-sea sailors on earth, navigating without chart or compass, by sun and stars, by landmarks and sea marks, by the flight of birds, the colour of water, the feel of swell and wind that a lifetime aboard prints into the body. The longship deserves a moment of quiet admiration, because everything that follows in this series rides on it. Clinker-built, overlapping planks riveted into a shell so light and flexible it worked with the waves instead of fighting them, with a true keel for sailing and a draft so shallow that a warship carrying 60 men could float in 3 feet of water. It could cross an open sea under sail, then come down a river, then be rowed, then be carried. It could land anywhere there was a beach, which meant for the first time in history that the attack could come literally anywhere the sea touched. When archaeologists lifted one of these ships from a burial mound at Gokstad 1,000 years later, shipwrights studied its lines with disbelief. A replica crossed the Atlantic in 1893 and outran the steamers. Nor were they strangers to wealth and its movement. Scandinavia in 793 was already laced into the world's trade, at market towns like Hedeby in Denmark and Kaupang in Norway, and at Birka on its Swedish lake. Furs and amber and walrus ivory moved south and silver moved north, including increasingly rivers of Arab silver coins, minted in Baghdad and Samarkand, flowing up the Russian rivers into Baltic hands. Archaeologists have dug tens of thousands of those dirhams out of Scandinavian soil. The men of the fjords, in other words, knew precisely what silver was, what it bought, and how much of it the soft lands to the south and west kept lying about in undefended houses of prayer. A word, while we are introducing them, about a word. To their victims, they were simply the heathen, the Northmen, the Danes, whatever their actual home, fjord. Viking, in their own tongue, was not a people at all, but an occupation. To go a Viking meant to go raiding over sea, the way one might go fishing or go trading. And many a man did all three in different summers of the same life. Most Norse men and women never went a Viking at all. The age has taken its name, in other words, from a part-time job, which is worth keeping in mind whenever the horned helmet cartoons crowd in. And no, the helmets, for the record, had no horns. Not one has ever been found. Why did they come? Not out of nowhere, and not, whatever the movies say, out of simple bloodlust. The Norse world was already trading down the very coasts it would soon raid. Scandinavian merchants knew exactly where the wealth of Francia and Britain sat and how lightly it was guarded. At home, chiefdoms were consolidating into kingdoms, and ambitious men needed silver and followers to compete, or needed, having lost, somewhere else to seek their fortunes. Populations were growing against a hard ceiling of arable land, and crucially, there was no shared rulebook with Christian Europe. A monastery's sanctity was internal to Christendom. From seaward, it looked like what it materially was: concentrated, portable, undefended wealth, much of it conveniently marked on the landscape by towers and bells. None of that excuses the drowned brothers of Lindisfarne, but it explains the pattern about to unfold. This was not an invasion at first, it was a business model. To understand the men in the shallows, not to forgive them, but to understand them, you have to know what they believe was watching. The Norse sailed under a crowded sky. Odin, the one-eyed lord of battle and poetry and cunning, who had hung himself on the world tree for wisdom and gave victory as unpredictably as he took it. Thor with his hammer, the farmer's and sailor's friend, whose sign men wore in little amulets, the way the monks wore crosses. Archaeologists find the two, hammer and cross, in the same graves of this in-between age, and sometimes a soapstone mould made to cast both. The smith hedging his customers' bets. Freya, who took half the battle dead, ran with her drowning net under the waves. Land spirits in every headland. A dragon prow, some said, was unshipped when nearing home, so as not to frighten the spirits of one's own shore. And over all of it, deeper than any god, lay fate. The Norns wove every man's thread at birth, and no cunning could add an hour to it. That belief could have bred despair. Instead it bred a terrifying practical courage. If the hour of your death was already fixed, then caution could not save you, and boldness could not doom you, so you might as well be bold. The only thing fate left in a man's own hands was the manner of his going and the name he left behind. Of all the verses the age remembered, the ones that mattered most say roughly this: cattle die, kinsmen die, you yourself will die, but the fame of a good name never dies. For a young man at an oar in 793, heaven was not the point. The story was the point. You can see that faith most clearly in how they buried their great ones. A generation after Lindisfarne, on a fjord in Norway, two women, a queen perhaps, and her companion, were laid in a complete seagoing ship. The magnificent carved vessel we call the Oseberg ship, with sledges and tapestries, buckets and beds, and the whole mound sealed over ship and all, a vessel for the last voyage. Kings went into the ground the same way, or out onto the water in ships set alight. A people who buried their dead in boats were telling us, as plainly as they could, what they believed a ship was, not a tool, a door. What worked once was tried again, immediately and everywhere. The very next year, raiders struck at Bede's own monastery at Jarrow, though this time the Northumbrians fought back and a storm wrecked part of the fleet. Proof briefly comforting that the sea wolves were mortal. It did not slow the tide. In 795 they found Iona, the holiest island of the Celtic West, mother house of saints off the Scottish coast. They came back in 802 and again in 806, when they killed 68 members of the community on the beach still called Martyrs Bay. The survivors eventually carried their treasures, perhaps including the great gospel book we know as the Book of Kells, inland to safety in Ireland. The islands of prayer which had been placed at the world's edge for holy solitude. discovered that they had been placed precisely on the new front line. Ireland's experience compressed the whole coming century into a preview. Rich in monasteries and poor in central kings, the island was raided almost annually within a decade of Lindisfarne. The Great School of Armagh struck 3 times in a single month, by one account. In time, the raiders' camps at the river mouths hardened into walled trading towns. One of them, at a black tidal pool the Irish called Dublin, grew into Dublin, a Viking town before it was ever an Irish city, and for 2 centuries one of the busiest slave markets of the Western world. The English Church, for its part, began quietly rearranging itself for a new world. Alcuin's letters after 793 carry practical undertones beneath the theology. Treasures were better kept inland. Communities on exposed coasts should think about where they might go. Relics, the spiritual capital of the age, began their long migrations away from the sea. Over the following decades, monastery after monastery on the exposed coasts was abandoned or moved, the manuscripts and saints' bones travelling by cart into the interior. The map of English holiness, drawn for 3 centuries by hermits seeking the wild edges of the world, was redrawn in a single generation by the simple new rule of survival. Pray out of sight of salt water. Ireland's rich monastic world became a hunting ground. The coast of Francia likewise. The pattern was the same on every coast, with local variations. Frisia's great trading town of Dorestad, the Rotterdam of its day, a mile of wharves on a Rhine channel, was sacked in 834, and then again the next year, and the next and the next. 4 years running, until the town that had handled half the North Sea's trade began to die, and its trade, in one of history's small ironies, drifted to safer harbours, including the North's own new markets. And when, in 844, a fleet grew bold enough to round Iberia and take Seville itself, the Emirate of Cordoba answered with something the raiders had not yet met in the West. A state with a professional army and a navy. The Moors retook the city, burned 30 ships, and, the chronicles say, hanged captured raiders from Seville's palm trees. The North took the lesson. For a century afterward, Al-Andalus was mostly left alone. The fury of the Northmen was a business, and businesses avoid unprofitable markets. There is a story, told later, perhaps polished in the telling, that Charlemagne himself, near the end of his life, watched Norse ships reconnoitre a southern harbour and wept at his window, not for any harm they could do him, he said, but because he foresaw what they would do to his descendants. Legend or not, the old emperor's tears were good forecasting. Within a generation of his death, Viking fleets were wintering at the mouths of the Seine and the Loire, and his grandsons were paying them rivers of silver to go away, which is, of course, the one payment that guarantees a return visit. The scale of what protection cost grew almost comically grim. In 845, a fleet of 120 ships, under a leader the sources call Ragnar, around whom the later Ragnar Lothbrok legends would gather like barnacles, rowed up the Seine to Paris itself, took the city at Easter, and departed only when the king of the Franks weighed out 7,000 pounds of silver, the first of the great state ransoms and the proof of concept for a century of them. 30 more such payments would follow on the Seine alone. The silver of Francia flowed north in cartloads, and much of it is still coming out of Scandinavian fields on the blades of ploughs. And here the story must keep its honesty about what the trade was. Silver and church plate were only part of the cargo. The other part was people. Captives from these raids, men, women, children, the boys of Lindisfarne among the first, were carried off into the largest slave network of early medieval Europe, sold through Norse market towns like Dublin and Hedeby. Some passed east along the river roads as far as the markets of the Islamic world. The Viking Age ran on many things: timber, wind, courage, iron. It also ran on this, and no honest telling of it looks away. The Franks, wealthier and better organised, eventually found the raiders' one weakness: rivers have banks. King Charles the Bald ordered fortified bridges thrown across the Seine and its sisters, low, garrisoned deliberately in the way. And the great raids upstream grew slower and costlier. The English, with shallower purses, more often bought time instead. The payments history remembers as Danegeld, weighed out in silver by the £1,000. Both responses worked, after a fashion. Both also taught the North the same profitable lesson. Whether by plunder or by protection money, the ships paid for themselves. It is worth remembering too what the silver became when it got home, because that is where the raiding age's engine really lay. A share from one good summer could set a young man up for life. A farm of his own, a bride price, oathmen standing in the assembly. Arm rings of hacked foreign silver were the age's resume, worn where everyone could count them. For every grizzled sea king in the sagas, there were 100 younger sons who went west precisely once, came home with enough, and spent the rest of their lives farming and retelling it. The monasteries of Europe were burning in the end to pay for barley fields in Norway. The defenders adapted as best they could. Coastal watches were set. Kings like Offa of Mercia ordered defences raised against pagan seamen even before Lindisfarne burned. The danger had been building on the horizon for those with eyes to see, but the raiders' advantages were structural. Choice of time, choice of place, and speed no land power could match. For 50 years, the pattern held, sharper every summer, deeper up every river. Then, in the middle of the 9th century, the pattern changed. Fleets grew from 3 ships to 30 to 300. Raiders began to stay through the winter, camped on coastal islands, eating the countryside. Wives and smiths and merchants started arriving with the war bands. The men from the fjords were no longer visiting, they were moving in. But that is next week's story. And Lindisfarne, here is the gentle ending the island itself earned. The community survived, battered, bereaved, but not destroyed, and not, in the end, driven from history. Monks returned. The shrine of Cuthbert endured on the island for another century, until the age's later storms sent the brothers on their long, famous wandering with the saint's coffin on their shoulders. 7 years on the roads of the north, ending at last at Durham, where Cuthbert lies to this day beneath the greatest Norman cathedral in the world. The Lindisfarne Gospels travelled with them and survive every page in the British Library, as radiant as the morning they were finished. On the island now there are quiet ruins, seabirds, and a small carved stone the archaeologists call the Domesday Stone. On one side, figures kneeling in prayer beneath the sun and moon, and on the other, a line of 7 warriors, swords and axes raised, marching forever left to right, carved, most likely, by someone for whom that morning was not history. is as close as we will ever come to a photograph of the 8th of June 793. Hold both sides of that stone in mind as we set out into this series. The Viking Age was the Axis, truly, and we will not pretend otherwise. But it was also, as we will see, ships and settlements, poems and law codes, trade routes that stitch 4 continents, and farmers looking for land at the edge of the maps. The men in the shallows at Lindisfarne have descendants in this story, and some of them, before we are done, will be discovering America. Next time, the raids become a conquest. An army the English chronicles called the Great Heathen Army comes to stay, and one young king hiding in a marsh with his kingdom burning refuses to accept the ending everyone else could see. Alfred and the fight for England. That is where we will leave it tonight. Sleep well wherever you are, and when you're ready, we'll go wandering again. Good evening and welcome back. Settle in, lower the lights if you'd like. There is nothing here you need to do tonight. Only listen and let the world grow quiet around you. Last time we stood on the sand at Lindisfarne and watched the Viking Age begin. 70 years of summer raids, of coastal fire and silver weighed out, of a fury that always eventually sailed home for the winter. Tonight the pattern breaks. In the autumn of the year 865, a fleet came to the coast of East Anglia that was not a raiding party. The English chronicles, groping for a word to match what they were seeing, called it the Heathen here, the Great Heathen Army. It did not burn the nearest monastery and leave. It made camp, demanded horses, and stayed and stayed. Year after year, kingdom after kingdom, until of all the ancient realms of the English, there remained exactly one. And that one led by a young man so beset that by the winter of 878, his kingdom had shrunk, in effect, to a few acres of dry ground in a Somerset marsh. This is the story of the Great Heathen Army, of the fall of the English kingdoms, and of Alfred, the only king England has ever called the Great, and the winter in the wetlands from which everything came back. First, the board and the pieces, because the England of 865 was not England at all. It was 4 kingdoms, old rivals, wedged together on one island. Northumbria in the north, ancient and cultured, and, as we heard last week, busily devouring itself. In 865 it had 2 kings at once, Osbert and Ella, fighting a civil war for the throne. Mercia crossed the Midlands, the old superpower now past its peak. East Anglia in the flat, rich east, smallest and most exposed. And Wessex in the south, the newest power, hardened by decades of fighting off coastal raids, ruled by a remarkable family. King Ethelwulf had 5 sons, and by God's grim arithmetic, the crown would work its way through nearly all of them. The youngest was a thoughtful, frequently unwell boy named Alfred, who had twice been taken on pilgrimage to Rome as a child, and who no one, 4th in line among living brothers, ever expected to see crowned. Wessex knew what was coming better than most, because Wessex had already met it in force. A generation earlier, in 851, a fleet the Chronicle counts at 350 ships had stormed Canterbury and London and put a Mercian king to flight. And the men of Wessex, under Alfred's grandfather and father, had met that horde at a place called Aclea, and, in the Chronicle's laconic triumph, made the greatest slaughter of a heathen army that we have ever heard tell of. the House of Wessex had also begun keeping ships. None of it had stopped the raids, but it meant the southern kingdom, alone in England, had a family memory of standing in the road and winning. Between the kingdoms, no common defence, no common purpose, and generations of cheerfully hiring Norse mercenaries against one another. From the deck of a longship, England looked less like a fortress than a banquet with the doors propped open. Of Alfred himself in these years, his biographer Asser preserves the small stories a court remembers. The boy who could not yet read, watching his mother hold up a book of English poems with a beautiful illuminated initial, promised to whichever son could learn it fastest. And Alfred taking it to his tutor, memorising and reciting it, carrying the prize away from his older brothers. The twice taken road to Rome, where the Pope girded the small boy with the belt of a consul, an honour his family would later remember, pointedly as something like a coronation. He grew up bookish in a family of warriors, plagued from youth by a mysterious recurring illness that historians still argue over, and by his own account he prayed as a young man for an affliction that would discipline his flesh without unfitting him for rule. It is the strangest royal prayer of the age. It was also, more or less, granted. And who came to the banquet? The army's commanders are half in history and half in firelight. The sagas, written centuries later and loving a good story, say the leaders were brothers, the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, that legendary raider we glimpsed at Paris, come to avenge their father's death in an English snake pit. History can verify no snake pit and no single Ragnar behind the legend. But the brothers themselves are real enough in the chronicles. Halfdan, Ubba, and the eldest, one of the strangest figures of the age, Ivar, called the Boneless. No one knows what the byname means. A disease of the bones, say some. A serpent's suppleness, say others. The sagas make him carried to battle on a shield, unable to walk, and deadlier for it, a strategist where his brothers were swords. What the record shows is a commander of unusual patience and cunning, who understood something no raider before him had acted on, that England's kingdoms could be taken, not robbed, taken, one at a time, if an army could only manage to stay. Staying was the innovation. Raids were limited by what ships could carry home. But an army that wintered in place, ate the countryside, and moved overland on stolen horses could campaign forever and hold what it won. East Anglia, where the fleet landed, chose a sensible humiliation. King Edmund's kingdom bought peace and supplied the army through the winter with what it demanded: horses, every raider a rider. In the spring of 866, the Great Army did not take ship. It mounted up and rode north, fast up the old Roman roads. And on the 1st of November, All Saints' Day, with the city crowded for the feast, it took York, the second city of Britain, before Northumbria's dueling kings had agreed there was a war on. York was no accidental target. Behind its patched Roman walls lay the North's great emporium, a river port with connections to Frisia and the Rhineland, a mint, an archbishop, streets of craftsmen. The army that took it acquired at a stroke a defensible fortress, a treasury, and a market for loot. Under Danish rule, the city would boom as never before. Within a generation, Jorvik, as its new masters called it, was one of the busiest towns in northern Europe, its workshops turning amber and antler and silver, its coinage flowing from Dublin to the Baltic. The Great Army had not come to destroy the English economy. It had come to own it. The two kings, Osbert and Aelle, did then what they had refused to do for years. They joined forces. In March of 867, they stormed their own city, broke through the walls, pressed into the streets. And there, in the tangled lanes, where numbers count for less than ferocity, the great army turned and destroyed them. Both kings died. With them, effectively, died the ancient kingdom of Northumbria, 170 years old, the land of Bede and Cuthbert and the Lindisfarne Gospels, extinguished in an afternoon, its next king a puppet who paid tribute to the army that appointed him. The sagas add a horror to Elle's death. That Ivar, avenging his father, had the king executed by the rite they call the Blood Eagle, a torture we will not detail, and which historians genuinely doubt. It appears only in late poetic sources and may rest on a misread verse about carrion birds. We flag it because you will meet it in every drama about this age. The sober record says simply that both kings fell. The age needs no embroidery to be dark. Mercia's turn came next. The army seized Nottingham and wintered behind its defences. The Mercian king called for help and got it. An army of Wessex marched north, led by King Ethelred and his youngest brother, Alfred, now about 19, in his first recorded campaign. The Allies besieged Nottingham and learned the frustrating lesson every English army of this generation would learn. A Viking army that did not want to fight simply did not fight. It sat behind earthworks, ate its stores, and waited out the besiegers' patience and harvest-time nerves. Mercia bought peace. The army rode back to York, unbloodied, richer and unbeaten. In 869, the army turned back east, to the kingdom that had first fed it, and this time East Anglia's money was no good. What exactly happened to King Edmund that November is wrapped in a saint's legend, but the core is solid. The last king of the East Angles was defeated, captured, and killed when he refused the army's terms. Refused, says the earliest account, to rule as a heathen's puppet or deny his faith. Within a generation, the story had its shape. The king bound to a tree, shot full of arrows, like a hedgehog's bristles, then beheaded, his followers finding the head guarded in the brambles by a grey wolf, calling "Here, here, here." Legend gently held, but the veneration was real and immediate. Even the Danes of the next generation struck coins in Edmund's honour. The shrine town that grew around him became Bury St Edmunds, and for centuries, until a certain dragon slayer displaced him, St Edmund was England's patron saint. The army had killed a king and created something more durable than a kingdom. We can even inventory its baggage. At Torksey on the Trent, where the army wintered the year before Repton, metal detectorists and archaeologists have mapped a camp of over 130 acres, a temporary city bigger than most English towns of the day. And the ground gave up its litter, hundreds of pieces of hacked silver and melted ingots, Arabic coins clipped for bullion, the little lead gaming pieces of men killing a long winter over board games, needles and spindle whirls that say women lived there, weights for the scales that turn plunder into payroll. It is as intimate as archaeology gets. Boredom, bookkeeping, and family life, in the middle of an army that was dismantling a civilization. We can stand closer to the Great Army than to almost any force of the early Middle Ages, because in the 1970s and 80s, archaeologists found one of its winter camps. At Repton in Derbyshire, where the chronicle says the army wintered in 873, driving the Mercian king over the sea and installing another client in his place. The diggers found the army's D-shaped rampart anchored on the river and swallowing the Mercian royal church into its defences, the invaders quartering themselves with perfect symbolic economy in the mausoleum of the kings they had just deposed. They found a warrior's grave by the church door, a tall man, dead of savage violence, buried with his sword, a Thor's hammer amulet at his neck, and a boar's tusk placed carefully on his body. And nearby, in a mound raised over a wrecked building, the disarticulated bones of well over 250 people, most of them robust men in fighting prime, packed around one central high-status burial. The Great Heathen Army, whatever these sagas sing, was mortal. It bled, it sickened through the hard winters, and it buried its dead in foreign ground by the hundred. Some of those bones, radiocarbon says, are consistent with exactly these years. We have, in all likelihood, met the army itself. Archaeology has lately given the campaign a face, hundreds of them. At Repton in Mercia, where the army wintered in 873, excavators found the Viking camp cut through a royal Saxon church, and beside it a burial mound holding the disarticulated bones of at least 264 people. 4/5 of them robust men in their prime, many bearing healed and unhealed wounds, laid around a central grave and buried with Viking weapons and coins that date the deposit to the army's stay. Whether they were the campaign's dead, gathered up and honoured, or a plague winter's toll is still argued. But there they lie, the Great Heathen Army itself, not saga names, but shoulder bones and sword cuts, resting in the ruins of the kingdom they had just pulled down. One nearby grave held a man buried with a Thor's hammer at his neck and a boar's tusk between his thighs, sent to the next world with his losses tactfully made good. By 874, the roll call stood thus: Northumbria, fallen; East Anglia, fallen; Mercia, broken and client ruled. The army itself now split, half under, half down, turning north to settle, and half under a new leader, a king named Guthrum, turning toward the last name on the list. Wessex had been bracing for years, and its royal brothers had already been consumed at the rate of roughly one per crisis. Ethelbald, Ethelbert, and now Ethelred, wearing the crown, with Alfred, the last brother, as his right hand. When the great army ceased reading in the last days of 870 and dug in at the junction of two rivers, the West Saxons did not wait to be dismantled by patience. What followed has gone into the books as the year of battles. 9 general engagements in 12 months, plus skirmishes past counting. The opening moves at Reading set the tone for the grimmest year Wessex had known. A West Saxon advance guard actually won the first meeting at Englefield. 4 days later, the brothers stormed the camp itself and were bloodily repulsed, leaving an ealdorman dead at the gate. Then came Ashdown, then defeat at Basing a fortnight later. Then a long, swaying battle at a place called Meryton that turned at dusk into another loss, with a bishop among the dead. 9 pitched fights in the year, says the chronicle, besides the endless skirmishing by companies of men whose names no one wrote down. No kingdom in England had absorbed such a year and stood. Wessex stood, barely, because its levies kept coming back, and because its enemies, for all their victories, could never land the killing blow on the royal house itself. The one the English never forgot came in the first days of January 871 on the high chalk downs at a place called Ashdown. The army had divided into 2 columns. So did the English. Ethelred facing the enemy kings, Alfred the Jarls. And then, with battle forming, King Ethelred would not move. He was hearing mass in his tent and declared he would serve God first and men after. The Danes began rolling down the hill, and Alfred, 21 years old, out of patience or out of genius, ordered the advance himself, leading his half of the army uphill, shield wall against shield wall, around a stunted thorn tree the chroniclers remembered for a century. Charging, wrote his biographer, like a wild boar. When Ethelred's column came up from prayers, the field broke. A Viking king dead, 5 Jarls dead, the chalk downs strewn with the fallen from end to end. It was the first time an English army in this war had beaten the great army in the open field. And it changed, in the short run, almost nothing. The army fell back on Reading, was reinforced by a fresh fleet, a great summer army out of the north, and won the next battles. In the spring, Ethelred, worn through at perhaps 30, died. His sons were small children, and nobody pretended a child could hold the last English kingdom. The council of wise men turned to the last brother. Alfred was crowned at about 22, in the middle of a losing war, and his first royal act of consequence was the one he is least celebrated for, and which probably saved everything. He counted his exhausted, thinned army, counted the enemy's reinforcements, and bought peace. The great army rode away to digest Mercia. Wessex had purchased 5 years. Guthrum spent them probing. In 875, his forces slipped past Alfred's musters to seize Wareham, then Exeter, deep raids testing the kingdom's reflexes. There were sieges, negotiations, hostages, and an oath sworn by the Danes on their holy armouring. An oath, the chronicle notes bitterly, they had never before sworn to any nation, and which they broke immediately, killing their hostages and riding on. Alfred was learning, at tuition rates paid in burned towns, the central truth of the war. Treaties with Guthrum were tactics. Only force was language. It is worth pausing on why the truce of the season felt inviolable. Midwinter was when the age itself stopped. Roads foul, forage gone, daylight a few grey hours. Fighted men of every nation went home because armies could not feed themselves in the field. And the 12 days were the holiest stretch of the Christian year. Courts at feast, retainers dispersed to their own hearths, the war formally asleep. Guthrum's genius, if that is a word, was to see all of that not as sacred, but as a target profile. The one fortnight when a king's location was public, his companions fewest, and his levies unmusterable. It was the same insight at the scale of a kingdom that had chosen a June morning at Lindisfarne. Then came Twelfth Night, 878. The Christmas truce was part of the furniture of the age. Armies went home, kings feasted. Alfred was keeping the feast at the royal estate of Chippenham, with a reduced household, when Guthrum, in a move of cold and brilliant impiety, attacked in the dead of winter, in the middle of the holy season, straight at the king's person. It nearly ended England there. The court was scattered or killed. The kingdom's machinery collapsed overnight. Part of the West Saxon nobility submitted, part fled overseas. The last English king of the last English kingdom got away into the winter dark with a band of companions and his family, a fugitive in his own land. He went to ground in the one country an army of horsemen couldn't use, the Somerset levels. In those centuries, a vast brackish inland sea of reed beds, alder thickets and hidden causeways where a local could vanish and a stranger could drown. At its heart, a low island of dry ground among the swamps, Athelney, the Isle of Princes. From there, through the late winter of 878, the King of Wessex waged the smallest royal war in English history. A fort improvised on the island, raids mounted through the marshes for supplies and morale, messengers slipping out by paths only fowlers knew, to whisper to the shires that the king lived and that there would be a muster in the spring. Athelney's defences were its neighbours as much as its waters. The levels were not empty, they were worked by fowlers, eel fishers and reed cutters, poor communities who knew every causeway and who did not betray him. Through that long Lent, the king's war was theirs. Punts moving by night, provisions gathered village by village, word carried to the ealdormen of the loyal shires. Asser says Alfred could reach the fort only by boat. The Danes, horse lords of the open chalk, never found a way in. It is one of history's better jokes that England was saved that spring less by its nobility than by its marshmen. And Alfred seems to have understood the debt. The first monastery he founded after the war he planted on Athelney itself. The legends, of course, found him there. The case, the king, sheltering anonymous in a swineherd's hut, so lost in his kingdom's ruin that he lets the good wife's loaves burn and takes his scolding meekly. A story first written down generations later and told ever since because it is England's favourite kind of story. The great man humbled at the hearth. The disguises Alfred as a harper in Guthrum's own camp, counting spears while he sang. History can vouch for none of it. What it can vouch for is stranger than the legends, that a deposed king in a swamp with no treasury, no capital and no army somehow kept a kingdom alive as pure information. A rumour of legitimacy passed hand to hand for 4 months, and that when he called, they came. There was one bright omen while he waited. Down on the North Devon coast, a Viking force under Ubba, last of the storied brothers, landed to crush the western levies, and the men of Devon, cornered on an old hill fort, came down at dawn and destroyed them. Ubba killed and taken with him the great raven banner, woven, the story says, by the daughters of Ragnar in a single noon, which fluttered for victory and drooped for doom. The West still knew how to win. It only needed its king. In the 7th week after Easter, early May 878, the summons went out along the marsh paths and the shire roads. The king would be at Egbert Stone, east of Selwood, on the appointed day. It was the whole gamble in a single rendezvous. If the shires had accepted Danish rule, no one would come, and the man waiting by the stone was simply an outlaw with a famous name. They came, the levies of Somerset, Wiltshire and Western Hampshire, marching in by their hundreds. And when they saw Alfred alive, says his biographer, they received him as one risen from the dead and were filled with joy. 2 days' march after that, 1 night in camp at the edge of the Downs, and then near a place called Eddington, the last English kingdom formed its shield wall on the high ground and put everything, the war, the crown, the future of the English language, though no one framed it quite that way, on one field. Hold the picture of what such a day demanded. A shield wall was not a formation so much as a single organism. Overlapping lindens, shoulder to shoulder, spears at every gap, the second rank leaning into the backs of the first. Battle meant walking that wall into another one and then holding an hour, 2 hours more of shoving, spear work over the rims, axes reaching for shield edges, the wounded passed back and the gaps closed, everything decided by which line of exhausted farmers and household men believed in itself longest. Edington was won by men who had spent the winter conquered, fined, taxed, humiliated, and who chose, when the summons came, to walk uphill into that. Courage in the age of the shield wall was not a moment, it was a morning. Of the battle itself, the sources give us one sentence apiece, and the sentence is enough. Alfred's wall held, fighting fiercely with a compact shield wall against the entire army of the pagans, held, pushed and broke them. The pursuit ran all the way to the gates of Chippenham, the stronghold where the war had begun on Twelfth Night. Whatever of the great army got inside was besieged there, starving for 14 days. And then Guthrum, king of the army that had toppled every kingdom in England, asked for terms. What Alfred did next is, depending on your taste, the most cynical or the most visionary act of the age, probably both, which is why it worked. He did not massacre the army he now had by the throat, because he could not. Exterminating one Viking host merely cleared anchorage for the next, as the Franks kept discovering. Guthrum's army was, at least, a known quantity, beaten, hungry, and suddenly very open to persuasion. So the terms of Edington were these: hostages and oaths as usual, the army to leave Wessex as usual, and then the unusual part. Guthrum would become a Christian, personally, publicly, permanently. 3 weeks later, the king of the heathens came to Alfred at Alla, near Athelney, into the marshes that had hidden his enemy all winter, and was baptized, with Alfred himself standing as godfather, lifting his adversary from the font as his spiritual son. 12 days of feasting followed, Alfred loading his new godson with gifts. The ceremonies were drawn out with deliberate weight. Baptism at Alla with 30 of Guthrum's chief men, then the formal loosing of the white baptismal fillet days later at the royal estate of Wedmore. Each stage witnessed, each stage another strand of obligation knotted around the new godson, who took at the font the very English royal name of Ethelstan. The age understood exactly what it was watching. Not a conversion of the heart, which no one could inspect, but a conversion of status, which everyone could. A pagan war king had been made, publicly and expensively, into a member of the family of Christian kings, with all the ways such a family can punish a member who disgraces it. Cynics, then and now, can read the whole ceremony as theatre. Guthrum's Christianity sat lightly on him, and his coins hedged like the smith's mould from last week's story. But the theatre did work that swords could not. It made Guthrum a king Christendom could deal with, a man whose oaths now had a god attached, bounded to kinship with the House of Wessex. When his army finally marched away, it went east, settled down, and by and large stayed settled. Guthrum ruled East Anglia as a more or less Christian, more or less law-abiding king until he died in his bed. An ending precisely no one at Lindisfarne could have imagined for a commander of the Great Heathen Army. The island was divided now by Treaty Line, Watling Street, the old Roman road, running diagonally across the map. Northeast of it, the Danelaw, the wide territories where Danish, not West Saxon, law ran, where the army's veterans took farms, married English wives, and became, at astonishing speed, farmers who had once gone a Viking. Their footprints are still everywhere in England, hundreds of villages ending in by and thorpe. Everyday English words that came off the longships: sky, knife, window, husband, law itself. And in the blood of the English East, as the geneticists now read it, a quiet Scandinavian tributary that never went home. The peace itself was written down. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum survives, short and businesslike. The boundary line up the Thames and the Lear and along Watling Street. The blood price of an Englishman and a Dane set carefully equal. Man for man. Rules for trade across the line. For buying horses and oxen. For the exchange of hostages when merchants crossed. Read it slowly, and a world appears between the clauses. Within months of Edington, Englishmen and Danes were expected to be trading livestock, and the treaty's chief worry is not war, but market fraud. Armies make the chronicle, cattle dealers make the peace. We even have the paperwork of the fortress system, a document called the Bygone Hour, drawn up in his son's day, which assigns to each burh a number of hides of land, each hide owing 1 man to the walls, 4 men to defend each pole of rampart. Read it, and the true nature of Alfred's achievement comes clear. Not inspiration, but administration. Thousands of obligations, calculated, assessed, and enforced across an exhausted kingdom, wall length by wall length, until safety was not a hope, but a rota. It is the least romantic document of the age, and among the most important. Kingdoms are saved twice, once on the hill at Edington, and once in the ledgers. And Alfred spent the rest of his reign making sure Edington could never be undone. This is the part with no battle scenes, and every historian's admiration. The network of burhs, 30-odd fortified towns, spaced a day's march apart, so that no army could ever again ride through Wessex faster than resistance could form. Their street grids still underlie towns from Oxford to Wallingford. The army reorganised in halves, 1 home, 1 in the field, so the harvest never again disarmed the kingdom. Ships built to his own outsized design to meet raiders at sea. And then, strangest of all, in a warlord king, the books. Convinced that God's anger had fallen on a land that had let learning rot, Alfred, in his 40s, between campaigns, chronically ill, learned Latin and personally translated the books he thought his people needed most, prefacing them with the gentlest mission statement any king has written, that all the freeborn young men of England who had the means should be set to learning until they can read English writing well. He rationed even his own hours. Asser describes the king's invention for it: 6 candles of equal weight, burning in succession, marked in inches, carried in a lantern of wood, an ox horn to tame the draughts. A clock, in effect, by which Alfred divided every day between the kingdom, his God, and his books. And one of the first recorded time management systems in European history. A king who had spent his 20s losing battles, spent his 40s defending his reading time. Both, in the long run, proved matters of state. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle itself, the source we have leaned on all evening, began in his court. The king who saved English England also, quite literally, wrote it down. He also quietly invented an idea. In his charters and his law book, Alfred stopped calling himself King of the West Saxons only, and began styling himself King of the Angles and Saxons, of all the English not under Danish rule. It was aspiration dressed as title. Wessex was one battered kingdom, and Watling Street still cut the island in half. But his children took the aspiration literally. his son Edward, and his formidable daughter Ethel fled. The Lady of the Mercians, who ruled Mercia in her own right, and took back the Danish towns fortress by fortress, spent 20 years rolling the treaty line north, and his grandson Ethelstan in 927 took York itself and became the first king of a single England. The country on the map tonight was drawn in its first rough stroke by a refugee in a marsh. Alfred died in 899, about 50 years old, having spent half his life ill and all of it at war or preparing for it. He left Wessex unconquered, the Danelaw contained, and a family that would finish the work. His formidable daughter Ethel fled. Lady of the Mercians, and his son and grandsons would take back the Danish territories fortress by fortress, until within 2 generations a king of Wessex was crowned king of a single realm the world was learning to call England. The country exists because the marsh held. One melancholy footnote before the marsh. Alfred was buried at Winchester, and his bones were moved more than once as churches rose and fell, until in the 18th century a prison was built over the site of their last resting place, and convicts digging the foundations scattered whatever remained. The king who saved England has today no certain grave at all. It bothered the Victorians immensely. One suspects it would not have bothered Alfred, who wrote once that every man ought to leave behind him the memory of good works, and who has, of monuments, the only one he planned for, the language this episode is spoken in. If you go to Athelney now, there is almost nothing to see, and that is the right monument. A low green rise in flat wet fields, a farm, a small stone marker put up centuries later. The marshes drained long ago into placid pasture. Stand there towards evening when the mist comes off the ditches and the whole story fits in the view. Somewhere under that mud, the fort of a king reduced to 4 acres, and a rumour, who came out of the reeds in the spring and won. Next time we turn the map on its side. While Danish armies were carving up England, their Swedish cousins were pulling their ships out of the Baltic and into the rivers of the endless East, toward the silver of Baghdad, the walls of Constantinople, and the making of Russia. The river roads are waiting. That is where we will leave it tonight. Sleep well wherever you are, and when you're ready, we'll go wandering again. Good evening and welcome back. Settle in. Lower the lights if you'd like. There is nothing here you need to do tonight. Only listen and let the world grow quiet around you. In the year 922, on the banks of the Volga River, deep in what is now Russia, further from the sea than any longship had a right to be, a fastidious Arab diplomat stood watching the camp of tall tattooed northern traders and taking notes. His name was Ahmad ibn Fadlan. He had come from Baghdad, from the most sophisticated court on earth, on an embassy to the Volga's Khan, and the strangers fascinated and appalled him in equal measure. "I have never seen bodies more perfect than theirs," he wrote, "tall as date palms, fair and ruddy, every man armed and marked from neck to fingertips with dark designs." He watched them trade furs and enslaved captives for silver coins. He watched their mourning washing with a merchant's disapproving eye, and before he left, he watched them give a dead chieftain to the fire. With his ship in a funeral, he would describe so vividly that we are still reading it 11 centuries later. The men he was watching called themselves, or were called by others, the Russ. Sweden was behind them, weeks away by river and portage, and the country that would one day take its very name from them, Russia, was, at that moment, being invented under their keels. Tonight, the Viking Age turns east. Silver, furs, river roads, and the strangest destiny of any Norse adventure. This is the story of the Russ. While Danes and Norwegians were sailing west into last week's story, England, Ireland, the Atlantic, the Vikings of Sweden looked out on a different sea and a different opportunity. The Baltic is almost an inland lake, and its eastern shore is not a coastline so much as a doorway. Behind the Gulf, where St. Petersburg now stands, the rivers of the Great Eurasian Plain begin, and they run with portages all the way to the Black Sea and the Caspian, to a people whose ships could be rowed, sailed, dragged and carried. The map whispered an enormous promise. From the Baltic, you could reach Constantinople. You could reach Baghdad's caravans. You could, if you were hardy enough, paddle from the world of the sagas into the world of the Arabian Nights. What pulled them through the doorway was, as ever in this series, silver. The Islamic world in the 9th century was running the richest economy on the planet, and it had an insatiable appetite for what the northern forest produced. Furs above all, sable, marten, black fox, beaver, plus honey, wax, walrus ivory, amber, and slaves. In exchange, silver dirhams flowed north in quantities that still astonish. Modern archaeologists have recovered hundreds of thousands of Arab coins from the soil of Sweden and the Baltic lands, hoard after hoard, the small change of a trade that must have run to millions. On the island of Gotland alone, a windswept Baltic trading crossroads. Farmers' fields have yielded more Islamic silver than anywhere else on earth outside the Islamic world itself. The Baltic's home ports grew rich on the turnaround. At Birka, on an island in a Swedish lake, archaeologists have opened grave after grave of the merchant town that flourished on the eastern trade, silks from Byzantium and beyond, Arab silver, weights and scales in the graves of men and women alike. For commerce here was a family business. One Birka grave furnished like a textbook warrior's, sword, axe, spears, 2 horses, a game board for tactics set on the lap, was assumed for a century to hold a man. DNA testing within the last decade showed the warrior was a woman. Scholars still debate what her weapons meant to her in life. But she sits well in this episode at the trading crossroads where every certainty about the Norse world gets complicated by the next spadeful of earth. The base camp of the whole eastern venture still exists as a quiet village, Staraya Ladoga, on a river just inland from the Baltic's easternmost gulf, the oldest town in Russia, and in its bones, a Norse one. Archaeology dates the first workshops there to the 700 Fees, a full generation before Lindisfarne, which quietly rearranges the whole story of the Viking Age. Before the first monastery burned in the west, Scandinavians were already trading peacefully in the east, cutting antler combs and stringing glass beads in a river town, waiting for the silver roads to open. The age did not begin with an axe. It began, like most ages, with a market stall. From Ladoga, the network grew southward along the water. Fortified river stations, boat sheds, way camps at the portages. The Slavic and Finnic peoples of the river country call the newcomers by a name history would keep and argue about: the Russ. It may come from an old Norse word for rowing, through the Finnish name for Sweden. Scholars have contested it for 3 centuries, with occasional national feeling. What no one disputes is what the word became. First a people, then a state, then the largest country on earth. Understand the river roads, and you understand everything the Rus became, because these were not the gentle highways the word suggests. They were an obstacle course, 2,000 miles long. The southbound route, the chronicles call the way from the Varangians to the Greeks, Varangian being the eastern name for a Norseman, began in the Gulf of Finland, climbed the Neva and crossed the Great Lakes, then went up the Volkhov, past Ladoga to Novgorod. Then it got hard. Upstream, the rivers dwindled to streams. At the watersheds, the ships came out of the water entirely, unloaded, set on log rollers or hauled onto shoulders, and were dragged overland, cargo carried in relays to the headwaters of the next river system, the Dnieper, flowing south. These portages were the toll gates of the whole enterprise. Whoever held them fed on the trade. Whole settlements existed to sell timber rollers, hire haulers, mend hulls, and every mile of portage was a mile a warband could ambush. The ships themselves changed for the rivers. The great sea-going dragons of the west were useless here. Too heavy for the portages, too deep for the shallows. The Rus convoys ran in lighter craft, the Byzantines called monoxyla, single-trunk boats, keels hollowed from one great tree, built up with plank sides, small enough for a crew to shoulder past a rapid and cheap enough to replace every season. And replaced they were, in an annual rhythm a Byzantine emperor described from intelligence reports. Each winter, the Slavic tribes of the forest felled and hollowed the hulls, floating them down at ice melt to sell to the Rus at Kiev. Each spring, the convoy fitted out, stepped masts, loaded a year's furs and wares, and in June, the whole flotilla dropped down river together, a trading fleet and an armed expedition in one. The state that became Russia began, in a real sense, as an annual convoy schedule. The Dnieper carried you south past Kiev, gathering current, and then delivered its famous ordeal. The rapids, a series of granite gorges where the river fell hissing between rocks with names that survive in both Norse and Slavic, and that translate to things like Gulpa and Everfierce and Wave Roarer. Some could be run by daring, others meant unloading everything again and carrying ships and cargo past the white water. While the horsemen of the steppe, the Pechenegs, waited at the fords precisely because they knew the boatmen must come to them, laden and dispersed. A Byzantine emperor, writing a manual for his son, described the Rus convoys at the rapids in the tone of a man describing salmon running a bare-lined river. Past the rapids, an island shrine where the crews sacrificed roosters in thanksgiving, then the open Black Sea, then at last, rising over the horizon like a rumour confirmed, the greatest city in the world. The other road bore east, down the Volga, through the lands of the Bulgars, where Ibn Fadlan met his traders, to the Khazar capital near the Caspian, where the river trade met the caravan trade. And northern furs began their journey to Baghdad's markets on camelback. The Rus themselves rarely pushed beyond the Caspian. They didn't need to. The silver came to the river. A merchant who survived a few round trips, rapids, portages, Pechenegs, plague, came home wealthy, The hordes of Gotland are the retirement accounts of the ones who made it. As for the ones who didn't, Sweden's runestones remember them, in stone shorthand that still stands along country roads. He fell in the east, he died in Sörkland, the Saracens' land. He was a good Drenga, a good lad. One famous stone family raised for a man named Ingvar and his brothers commemorates an entire expedition to the Caspian in the 1040s, from which the sagas agree almost no one returned. Trade posts become protection rackets become governments. It happened on the Volga and Dnieper in less than a century, and the Russian primary chronicle, written by Kievan monks a quarter millennium later, mixing memory, legend and politics, tells the founding story the way the Rus themselves liked it told. The scale of the silver that flowed north still has the power to stop a museum visitor cold. On the Baltic island of Gotland alone, a place of farmers and harbours, never a kingdom, some 700 silver hoards have come out of the fields, and they are still coming. In 1999, a farmer's field at Spillings yielded the largest Viking silver treasure ever found anywhere. Nearly 200 pounds of it, over 14,000 Arab coins, armloads of arm rings and ingots, buried under the floor of an outbuilding around the year 870 and never reclaimed. Hold one of those dirhams to the light and you can read, in Arabic, the mint and the year, Baghdad, Samarkand, Tashkent, each coin a fossilized journey of 3,000 miles, fur by fur, portage by portage, and every unclaimed hoard is a small unwritten tragedy. Someone dug that pit, meaning to come back. In the year 862, says the chronicle, the quarrelsome tribes of the north, Slav and Finn alike, had driven out their Varangian tribute takers, tried self-rule and fallen into chaos. So they sent across the sea an invitation that historians have been raising eyebrows at ever since. Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come and rule over us. And 3 brothers came of the people called Rus with their households. The eldest, Rurik, took Novgorod. Invitation or invasion, dressed up politely for posterity, read it as you will. What is certain is that a dynasty took root. For the house of Rurik would rule these lands, through every convulsion for more than 700 years, until the age of Ivan the Terrible. Few royal houses in history have run so long a road from so brief a paragraph. Rurik's successor made the move that made Russia. Oleg, kinsman, regent, sea king, took the young dynasty's power south along the river road, and in 882 seized the hill town of Kiev, perfectly placed above the Dnieper, where the forest trade met the steppe. Mother of Rus cities, the chronicle has him proclaim it. Novgorod handled the north, Kiev ruled the road, and the state historians called Kievan Rus was in business. A strange, vigorous hybrid from birth. Norse princes and war bands, Slavic farmers and language, Finnish trappers, steppe neighbours, Byzantine goods, and a capital whose business model was escorting the summer trade convoy downriver with royal muscle. Igor's own career had already taught the dynasty the limits of the old ways in the most spectacular fashion. In 941, he took a great fleet against Constantinople itself and met the empire's secret weapon. The Byzantine ships came outfitted with bronze siphons, and from them poured the incendiary the world learned to call Greek fire. A petroleum mixture, its recipe a state secret so well kept that it is lost to this day, which burned on the surface of the sea itself. The chronicle's description has the numb precision of survivor testimony. It was, said the Rus who lived, like lightning from heaven. Men let burning into water that was also burning. The fleet was destroyed. The lesson was absorbed. With the empire, one traded. One did not conquer. And the treaties that followed were negotiated by a power that had felt exactly where the limits lay. The dynasty's early generations read like a saga cycle, and one figure towers over them: a woman. When Prince Igor, Rurik's son, was killed by a tributary tribe, the Drevlians, while collecting tribute once too often, his widow Olga took the regency for their small son. And the chronicle devotes page after relishing page to what she did next. The Drevlians, confident, sent envoys proposing she marry their prince. She had the first embassy buried alive in their boat, the second burned in a bathhouse, then at a funeral feast on her husband's grave mound, her retainers cut down thousands more, and when their capital still held out, she took it, says the chronicle, by asking a gentle tribute of 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each house, then releasing the birds at dusk with slow burning matches tied to their feet, each one flying home to its own eave and thatch. The city burned, and Olga's name became a byword. Kiev itself, by Olga's day, was becoming worth ruling. On its bluffs above, the Dnieper stood the princely halls and the pagan idols. Below, along the river, spread the Podil, the workshop and market quarter, all boatyards, forges, glassmakers and fur warehouses, where a dozen languages haggled through the trading season. Downhill and uphill, commerce and power, the two halves of the Rus enterprise in one town plan. Travellers of the next century would call Kiev a rival to Constantinople in splendour, which was affectionate exaggeration. But affectionate exaggeration is itself a kind of measurement of how fast a portage town had risen. How much of that is history and how much is a saga writer enjoying himself, no one can say. The bird trick appears in legends across the world, but hold the sequel beside it, because the same woman did something perfectly historical and far more consequential. Around 957, Olga travelled to Constantinople, dazzled and was dazzled, and became the first of her house to be baptised a Christian. The emperor himself stood in some ceremonial role at the font. Her son refused a new faith. His warriors would laugh at him, he said. Her grandson would not laugh. The chronicle, which adored her, gave Olga the epitaph history has kept. She was, it says, the dawn before the sunrise. And Olga, the terrible avenger, has a second, better claim on history. She was the dynasty's first real administrator. After the Drevlian War, the chronicle shows her doing something no saga heroine bothers with, touring the territories and replacing the old provocative system of roving tribute collection, the very practice that had killed her husband, with fixed stations and set quotas, regular places, regular amounts, regular seasons. It reads, dull beside the burning birds, and it built more than they burned. Taxation with the schedule is very nearly the definition of a state. And it was a widowed regent, minding her son's inheritance, who gave the Rus theirs. That unlaughing son deserves his portrait, for he was the last purely Viking figure on the Kievan throne. Sviatoslav, shaven head with a single warrior's lock, a gold earring, moustaches like a Turkic Khan, a man who, on campaign, used no tent and no pot, roasting strips of meat over coals and sleeping on his saddle blanket under the stars. His life was one long campaign. He broke the Khazar power on the Volga forever, fought the Bulgars and Byzantines down the Danube, and dreamed of moving his capital south. And his death was pure saga, ambushed at the Dnieper rapids by the Pechenegs. At the choke point, every trader feared, and his skull, so the story goes, bound in gold and made into the Khan's drinking cup. The rivers gave the Rus everything, they collected their tolls too. Through all of it, every ambition on the rivers bent toward one magnet, Constantinople. The Rus called it simply Miklagard, the great city, and no other name in the Norse world carried such freight. 500,000 people behind triple walls, domes of gold above a harbour of 10,000 masts, mechanical lions that roared beside the emperor's throne, and a throne that rose toward the ceiling while ambassadors knelt. For the wild north, it was Rome, El Dorado, and Heaven's forecourt in one skyline. The city's own memory of that first raid survives in the sermons preached while the smoke still hung. The patriarch Photius, one of the great minds of the age, stood in the great church and asked his congregation to consider what had found them. A nation obscure and of no account, he said, from the very ends of the earth, savage, nameless until now. And it had ravaged the suburbs of the Queen of Cities, while her armies looked the other way. Thunderbolt from an unknown sky, punishment for sin, humiliation pointedly rehearsed. The sermon could have been preached at Lindisfarne, 67 years and 3,000 miles apart. Two Christian civilizations at opposite corners of Europe, introduced to the same neighbours in the same paragraph of shock. What did the empire want with the wild north? That it kept signing treaties instead of simply closing the sea. Everything is the answer. The Rus brought the forest's wealth, furs for the court's winters, wax for the 10,000 candles of its churches, honey and slaves for its markets. That dark commerce again, which no honest telling omits. But above all, the North sold the one commodity every rich empire runs short of: fighting men. The treaties include clauses about Rus serving in the imperial forces almost from the beginning. Constantinople had learned the oldest lesson of wealth, that the people most likely to break down your door make the best doorkeepers if the pay is right. And the North, for its part, discovered that the great city's silver could be earned as well as stolen. Their introduction in the summer of 860 was pure Viking. 200 ships out of the Black Sea's morning haze, while the emperor and army were away on the eastern frontier. The suburbs burning, the city in panic, the patriarch preaching that the unknown nation from the north had been sent for the people's sins. The raiders melted away with their plunder before anything could be organised against them, exactly as at Lindisfarne. Except that this victim kept better records, and this victim was the richest negotiating partner on earth. Within a generation, raid had turned to treaty. Agreements survived from the early 900s. Astonishing documents in which the empire grants the Rus trading rights in the city, lodging in a suburb, entry through one gate in parties of 50, unarmed, a month's provisions, free baths, the fine print of two worlds learning to profit from each other instead. The chronicle adds the flourish that Oleg, to seal his triumph, nailed his shield to the city's gates. Perhaps. The trade clauses are duller and more believable, and they mattered more. Not every meeting went the trader's way, and the empire's ledger of the Rus records one terrible lesson. In 941, Prince Igor, Olga's husband, whom we shall meet again, came down on Constantinople with a great fleet while the imperial navy was away, and the city met him with a squadron of old hulks refitted with its secret weapon. Greek fire, the empire's jealously guarded incendiary, pumped through bronze siphons and burning even on the surface of the sea, fell on the Monoxilla, and the Chronicle of the Rus themselves preserves the survivors' explanation to their countrymen. The Greeks have the lightning from heaven, they said, and set us on fire with it. Men leapt burning into the water and sank under their mail. Eagle came home with a remnant, and this is the truly Rus part of the story. Within 3 years, had negotiated a fresh trade treaty on nearly the old terms. The rivers taught pragmatism above all. You could lose a fleet to heaven's lightning and still want the silk clauses back. And then the relationship produced its most famous institution. In 988, the Emperor Basil II, fighting for his throne against rebels, made a desperate bargain with Vladimir of Kiev, Olga's grandson, 6,000 Varangian warriors, in exchange for the ultimate prize, an emperor's sister as bride. Princesses born to the purple were not given to barbarians. The price of this one was Vladimir's baptism, and with him, by decree, in the Dnieper's waters, his peoples. The chronicle wraps the conversion in a beloved legend. Vladimir shopping among the faiths, rejecting Islam. Drink, he supposedly said, is the joy of the Rus. We cannot do without it. Unimpressed by the Germans' Latin rite, until his envoys came back from the great church in Constantinople, saying we no longer knew whether we were in heaven or on earth. Legend or not, the choice set 1,000 years of Russian history on its axis. Orthodox, Byzantine facing, baptized in a river by a Viking's great-grandson. Service in the Guard was a world of its own, and we know its texture from both ends of Europe. The axemen stood watch at the bronze doors, and behind the throne through the endless liturgies of court ceremony. They marched at the emperor's stirrup on campaign. They policed the palace's conspiracies and occasionally joined one. Sagas written in Iceland track their careers like proud alumni newsletters. Byzantine chroniclers note their drinking with the exasperated fondness of employers everywhere, calling them the emperor's wine bags and never questioning their loyalty at sword point. A Norse boy could leave a farm on a fjord and come home a decade later with gold in his sea chest, a Greek cloak, and stories no one could check. Thousands did exactly that. The Guard was the age's great finishing school, and its graduates seeded the North with silver, swagger, and the persistent legend of Miklagard. The 6,000 became the Varangian Guard, the Emperor's personal regiment of Norsemen, axe-bearers at the throne, the most prestigious employer in the Viking world. For the next century, every ambitious northerner with a sword dreamed of a tour in Miklagard. The pay was fabled, the loyalty absolute. The Guard famously served the office of emperor no matter who held it. And the perks entered legend, including the reported right, when an emperor died, to file through the treasury and carry off what a man could lift. Runestones across Sweden logged the career path. He was in the Greeks' land, he took his share of gold. One veteran of the Guard scratched his name in runes into the marble parapet of Hagia Sophia's gallery, where tourists photograph it today. Halfdan carved this, the world's most sublime church, autographed by a bored northern bodyguard, and the Guard's most famous alumnus of all, a towering, gifted, alarming young Norwegian named Harald, will get his own reckoning in our final episode at a bridge in Yorkshire. How Ibn Fadlan came to be on that riverbank is a story in itself. the king of the Volga Bulgars, a Muslim convert with the Khazar Khagan's hand heavy on his neck, had written to the Caliph in Baghdad, asking for instruction in the faith and for money to build a mosque and a fortress. The embassy's answer was a journey of nearly a year, out of Baghdad with the caravans, wintering in the frozen city of Jurjania, where Ibn Fadlan complains believably. His beard froze solid after bathing, then north with the spring across the steppe. Camels floundering through snow, rivers crossed on camel skin rafts, the diplomat counting each of the dozens with the survivor's precision. He arrived to find, among other wonders, nights so short in the northern summer that the faith's 5 daily prayers crowded impossibly together, a theological puzzle he recorded with the same care as the tattoos of the Rus. The report he wrote is one long marvel at the world's width. It is also proof of the same fact. The Dirham hordes prove from the other end. In the 10th century, Baghdad and the Baltic were neighbours, with a very long garden fence, which returns us, for this episode's quiet centre, to the man on the riverbank where we began. Because Ibn Fadlan's report is the closest thing we will ever have to standing among the Rus ourselves, and it deserves a slow reading. He noticed what a civilised Baghdadi would notice: their size and bearing first, the finest physical specimens he had seen, and their gear, every man, with axe, sword and knife, never out of reach, the swords Frankish made, broad and grooved. Their commerce, the moment a trader's ships anchored, he went ashore to a wooden idol and laid out bread, meat and drink, asking the god plainly for a rich buyer who wouldn't haggle. Their accounting, a man who accumulated 10,000 dirhams melted them into a neck ring for his wife. Count the rings, know the fortune. Their squalor by the standards of a man from the city of public baths, the shared washing bowl each morning that made the fastidious diplomat shudder and write a paragraph, and their women's finery, on each breast a little box of iron, silver or gold, with a ring for the knife, strings of green glass beads, for which he notes with a trader's precision. The men paid absurdly, a dirham per bead. Then a great man among them died, and Ibn Fadlan witnessed and set down, step by grave step, a Rus ship funeral. We will keep the telling gentle and honest. The chieftain lay in a temporary grave while his ship was drawn up on the river bank onto a scaffold of wood, and his wealth divided, a third to his household, a third to drink, a third to the pyre goods. Garments were sewn for him, cushions and silks prepared, and among his slaves a young woman volunteered, was expected and was watched. The account makes clear, in ways that make her freedom to refuse very doubtful, to accompany her master. Through the days of preparation, she was treated with a strange ceremonial honour, singing, drinking, indulged in everything. On the last day, she was lifted 3 times over a doorframe, to look, she said, into the other world, where she saw her master in a green and beautiful place, calling for her. What followed aboard the ship, at the hands of an old woman the Rus called the Angel of Death, Ibn Fadlan records plainly, and we will not. It was a killing, and the account never lets you forget the human being at the centre of it. Then the dead man's nearest kinsman, naked, walking backward, set the first torch. Every onlooker added wood, and the ship, the chieftain, the slave girl, and all burned. In a rising wind, the whole pyre gone, Ibn Fadlan says, in scarcely an hour. A Rus man at his shoulder laughed at the Arabs, who, he said, put their dead in the earth for the worms. We burn them in a moment, and they enter paradise at once. And the wind, he added, was his master's welcome, come quickly to take him. Then they raised a mound over the ashes, set up a post carved with the dead man's name and his king's, and went back, the account implies, to trading. 11 centuries later, scholars still work through that scene line by line. For its gods and its cruelties, its tenderness and its theatre, and for the vertigo of the thing itself. The meeting of Baghdad and the Baltic on a riverbank in the middle of everywhere, recorded by an honest man who wrote down what he saw, whether or not he understood it. History is mostly made of such meetings. It is very rarely lucky enough to have such a witness. The Caspian too learned what the Black Sea knew. Around 903, Arab chroniclers record a Rus fleet, 500 ships, they say, though chroniclers' arithmetic is always generous, passed down the Volga by arrangement with the Khazars, promising half the plunder, and fell on the Caspian southern shores, sacking towns from one end of that inland sea to the other, and camping for months on offshore islands where no one could reach them. The return journey was the reckoning. The Khazar Khan's Muslim guardsmen, enraged at the slaughter of fellow believers, met the laden fleet at the Volga mouth, and 3 days of fighting left most of the raiders dead. The east ran on trade, but it was never gentle commerce. The same hulls carried furs one season and fire the next, and the line between merchant and raider was exactly as wide as the opportunity. The strangest thing about the Eastern Vikings is how completely they dissolved into what they created. Within 4 or 5 generations, the House of Rurik spoke Slavic, prayed east, and gave its children names like Vladimir and Yaroslav. The warband's grandsons were boyars. The river station tolls had become estates taxes. Yaroslav the Wise, in the mid-1000s, ruled a Kiev with golden dome cathedrals and a written law code, and married his daughters to the kings of France, Hungary and Norway. The River Road dynasty woven into every royal house of Europe. When the Guards' veterans sailed home to Sweden with their gold, they were returning from a world their great-grandfathers had built a road to, and their grandsons would barely remember was Norse at all. Among the birch-bark letters of Novgorod, one bundle belongs to a boy named Onfim, 6 or 7 years old, learning his letters 7.5 centuries ago. He copied his alphabet dutifully, and then, like every schoolboy since writing began, drifted. Warriors with improbable numbers of fingers, a horseman spearing an enemy labelled in a proud child's hand as himself, and a signed self-portrait as a fantastical beast with the caption, "I am a wild animal." Scholars adore Onfim beyond all reason, and rightly. Empires, conversions and river roads are history's skeleton, but a bored child drawing himself as a hero. In a merchant city the longships built is its pulse. The rivers kept their own records. At Novgorod, the wet soil has preserved hundreds upon hundreds of letters written on birch bark by perfectly ordinary medieval people. Loans and lawsuits, shopping lists, marriage proposals, a small boy's doodles of himself as a knight. The daily voice of a city the river roads built. And the name the traders carried, Rus, settled over the whole land of the Eastern Slavs and never lifted. It is on the map tonight, across 11 time zones. Not bad for a word that may have started as the rowers. Next time, we turn with the setting sun. While the Swedes rowed east towards silver, Norwegians were sailing west into the empty Atlantic, to an island of fire and ice where they built the world's oldest parliament, to a Greenland that wasn't, and 5 centuries before Columbus, to a coastline with wild grapes that they could not hold. Iceland, Greenland, Vinland, the far shore of the Viking world. That is where we will leave it tonight. Sleep well, wherever you are, and when you're ready, we'll go wandering again. Good evening and welcome back. Settle in. Lower the lights if you'd like. There is nothing here you need to do tonight. Only listen and let the world grow quiet around you. Tonight the longships leave history's main roads altogether and sail off the edge of the map. Not east, where the rivers led to emperors, and not south, where there were kingdoms to plunder, but west into the open North Atlantic, the widest, coldest, emptiest water any European had ever pointed a bow at. Out there, beyond the last known islands, lay a chain of stepping stones no one had charted, an island of volcanoes and glaciers where a strange experiment in government was waiting to be invented. A vaster island of ice with a hopeful name. And beyond them both, 5 centuries before Columbus, a low green coastline with wild grapes and hostile strangers, which the Norse would find and name and briefly settle and let go. This is the story of the Westward Vikings, of Eric the Red and his son Leif the Lucky, of Gudrid the far-travelled, and a baby born at the world's edge, and of the one Viking discovery that was simply too far and too early to keep. The Atlantic adventure began, as so much does in the sagas, with people getting lost. A Norwegian bound for the Faroe Islands, storm-driven far past them, came home talking about a huge unknown land to the northwest. A Swede named Gardar sailed to check, followed the coast all the way around, and proved it an island. Enormous, green in its valleys, smoking oddly in places, and utterly empty. A third voyager, Floki, went to stay and famously took 3 ravens for the crossing, releasing them one by one on the open sea. The first flew back the way they had come, the second circled and returned to the ship, and the third flew ahead, and Floki followed it to land. He wintered badly, lost his livestock to the cold, climbed a mountain in spring and saw a fjord below still choked with drift ice, and named the whole country in disgust Iceland. The name stuck, so oddly did the islands appeal. One of Floki's crew came home insisting that in that country butter dripped from every blade of grass. Between the ice and the butter, the North knew everything it needed: hard land, free land. Pause on what such a crossing meant, because the emigrants did not make it in warships. The Atlantic workhorse was the Nar, the longship's stout merchant cousin, shorter, deeper, higher-sided, decked only at bow and stern, with a crew of 12 and a hold that carried everything a transplanted life required. Picture the load of one household: cattle and sheep penned amidships, horses hobbled, hay and seed corn, iron tools, chests of clothing and keepsakes, children, the elderly, dogs, all open to the sky for 600 miles of the grey North Atlantic. With fair winds, Norway to Iceland ran a week or 2. With foul ones, boats wandered for a month or vanished entirely. And the saga's record land takings that began with burying a child at the landing beach. Every farm in Iceland's history starts with the family standing in such a boat, watching for Floki's mountains, having bet everything they owned and everyone they loved on an island described to them around a fire. And free land in the Norway of the 870s had just become the scarcest thing there was. A hard-handed king, Harald Fairhair, was hammering the old independent chiefdoms into a single crown, and for every chieftain who bent, another looked west. What followed over the next 60 years was one of the great migrations of the Middle Ages, the landnam, the land-taking. Whole households, chieftains and their wives, children, servants and slaves, cattle bawling in open boats, crossed 600 miles of the worst ocean in the world to claim empty valleys by walking their bounds with fire. Perhaps 10,000 came in the first generation, twice that by the end. They came mostly from Western Norway, but many by way of Ireland and the Scottish Isles, bringing Irish wives and Irish slaves. The genetics of modern Iceland still says so plainly. The men's lines mostly Norse, the women's substantially Gaelic. The sagas remember the founders by name, farm by farm, the first permanent settler, Ingolfur Arnason, tossing his high seat pillars overboard and vowing to build where the gods brought them ashore. A bay of steam vents he called Smoky Bay. Reykjavik. There is a capital city there now. Among the founders, the tradition honours most was a woman, Aud the Deep-Minded, widow of a Norse king of Dublin, who, when her son fell in Scotland, had a gnar built secretly in the forest, gathered her granddaughters, her followers and her bondsmen, and sailed for Iceland as the head of her own migration, pausing en route to marry the granddaughters into 2 island dynasties. In Iceland she claimed lands as broad as any chieftains, freed her slaves and gave them farms, and a Christian already, generations early, had herself buried on the tide line below high water where no pagan ground could claim her. The land taking has many founding fathers. Its founding mother outplanned most of them. What the settlers built on their empty island is the part historians never stop marvelling at. No king, no lords, no towns, no army, none of the machinery their cousins were building in Kiev or fighting in Wessex. Instead, in the year 930, the chieftains of the whole island began meeting once a year in midsummer on a lava plain where a great cliff makes a natural sounding board, at an assembly they called the Althing, laws recited aloud from the law rock by a speaker elected for the purpose, disputes judged by panels of farmers, marriages made, news traded, ale drunk. It was not a democracy. Chieftains and their followings held the power. Women and slaves held little. But it was law without a throne, a commonwealth of farmers at the edge of the world, and it ran for over 300 years. The Althing still meets. It is the oldest surviving parliament on earth, and it was invented by the grandchildren of the men who burned Lindisfarne. The Commonwealth's finest hour came at the millennium, and it belongs in any story of how these people governed themselves. By the year 1000, Christianity was split in Iceland. 2 laws, 2 faiths, kin against kin. The Althing itself on the edge of dissolving into 2 hostile assemblies. And the chieftains did an extraordinary thing. Both sides agreed to submit the question to one man, the law speaker, Thorgeir of Ljósavatten, himself a pagan priest, and to abide by whatever he ruled. Thorgeir walked to his booth, lay down and spread his cloak over his head, and for a day and a night he lay silent under it while the island waited. Then he rose, walked to the law rock and gave his ruling. One law for all, and the law would be Christian, baptism for everyone, with quiet allowances in private for the old customs while a generation passed. Both sides kept the bargain. A civil war of religion, the kind that soaked Europe in blood for centuries, was settled in Iceland by one man thinking under a cloak. Because the alternative, everyone at that assembly understood, was the end of the law itself. The old gods went out of Iceland the way its ships came in, by negotiation. And because long winters breed long stories, this scatter of turf farms became, in time, the memory of the entire Norse world. Nearly everything we have spent 4 evenings retelling, Ragnar's sons, Harald's Byzantium, the gods and the funerals, survives because Icelandic farmers wrote it down. Generations later, in the great vernacular literature we call the sagas, terse, ironic, unsentimental family epics, history and fiction braided so tightly that scholars still argue over every strand. Keep that in mind tonight especially. For what happened next, Greenland and what lay beyond it. The sagas are very nearly all we have, and where we can check them against the ground, they have proved startlingly good. Enter, banished, one of the great troublemakers of the age. Eric the Red, red of hair and beard, and by the record, red of temper, had already left Norway because of some killings, as the saga puts it, with characteristic economy. Settled in Iceland, he killed again in a feud over borrowed benchboards and a landslide, and the Althing's justice handed him the Commonwealth's standard sentence for men it could not afford to keep: outlawry. 3 years beyond the reach of the law, which meant, for a man with enemies, 3 years somewhere no enemy could sail. Eric had heard of such a place, Skerries and a glimpsed coast far to the west, sighted generations earlier by another storm-blown sailor. He spent his exile exploring it, and found, behind the ice-choked eastern coast, deep sheltered fjords in the southwest, where the grass grew thick in summer, with seals and salmon, reindeer and walrus, and not another human soul in reach. When his sentence ran out, he sailed home and launched history's most famous real estate campaign. He called the country Greenland, the saga says, because men would be drawn to go there if the land had an attractive name. It is the age's best joke, and it worked. In 985 or 986, 25 ships sailed west from Iceland behind him, loaded with the households of the hopeful. 14 arrived. From them grew 2 settlements of turf-built farms, the eastern and western settlements, that would cling to those fjords for 4.5 centuries. A bishopric, churches, a few thousand souls at the peak, the most remote outpost of Christendom, closer to the North Pole than to Rome. Life on those fjord farms found its own strange Arctic rhythm. The turf halls were built like fortresses against cold, walls 6 feet thick, byres joined to living quarters, so the cattle's warmth was not wasted. Through the sunless months, the animals lived indoors, eating the summer's hay down to the last armful, and a farmer's whole year balanced on the weight of that haystack. Spring brought the seal migrations up the coast, the settlement's true daily bread, then the brief, brilliant green of the fjord heads, the frantic hay-making, the autumn slaughter sized precisely to the hay. It was European farming, rebuilt as a kind of high-wire act. And for 400 years, astonishingly, the Greenlanders kept their footing. Modern science has added a poignant footnote to the Greenlanders' story, read from their own bones. Isotope analysis of skeletons from the settlement churchyards tracks the colony's diet across 4 centuries and shows it slowly turning from the farm to the sea. The founders ate like Norwegians, mostly meat and milk from their cattle and sheep. Their last descendants were living, by the end, overwhelmingly on seal. The farms were failing by degrees as the cold came down, and the people adapted, season by season, further and further from the European pattern they had crossed an ocean to preserve, without ever quite crossing the line into the Inuit way of life that the climate actually demanded. They bent remarkably far. The story in the bones is of a people who did nearly everything right within the world they knew, and whose world had simply drifted out from under them. And the name itself repaid the honesty. Greenland, Eric admitted, the sagas quote him nearly winking, was chosen because men would be drawn to go there if the land had an attractive name. It is sometimes called history's first real estate advertisement, and the joke is old, but it worked. 25 ships sailed from Iceland with the first colonists in 985, and only 14 arrived. The rest turned back or lost to the sea, a tithe paid before a single house was raised. The survivors named their fjords for themselves and set to work. Bishop and tithe followed the farmers, as they always did. By the early 1200s, Greenland had its own cathedral at Gardar, a stone church longer than many in Norway, with bells shipped across the whole North Atlantic and glass in its windows. And its tithes went to Rome, partly in walrus ivory, weighed and receipted by clerks in the papal accounts. There is something quietly astonishing in that ledger line, the most remote diocese of Christendom, paying its dues in the teeth of the sea. What kept Greenland alive was not the grass, it was teeth. Walrus ivory was the luxury plastic of medieval Europe, carved into crozier heads, reliquaries, sword fittings and chest sets, including, most likely, the famous hoard found centuries later on the Isle of Lewis. And the Greenland fjords guarded the richest walrus grounds in the known world. The far north hunt had one export, more glamorous even than ivory: the living polar bear, the medieval world's ultimate diplomatic gift. A Greenlander who could deliver a white bear to a king could name his reward. One saga-era Icelander famously presented a bear to the Danish court and dined out on it, so to speak, for the rest of his career. Bears from these hunts padded through the menageries of emperors, and one probably walked in the Tower of London, fishing the Thames on a long leash. It is worth holding that image against every stereotype this series has fought. The Viking Age ending not with an axe, but with the world's most dangerous housewarming present, wrapped in a net in the bilge of a Nar. Every summer, the settlement's men rowed and sailed hundreds of miles further north again, past the Arctic Circle to the hunting grounds. Every few years, a ship ran the gauntlet to Norway with tusks and hides and returned with iron, timber, grain and news. It was a life of magnificent precariousness, a European farming and hunting society grafted onto the Arctic's absolute margin, solvent only so long as Europe paid premium prices for ivory and the sea lanes stayed open. Remember that ledger. The season will turn on it. For all its remoteness, the colony insisted on being properly European. In the 12th century, Greenland petitioned for, and received, its own bishop, and the sea at Gardar grew into the settlement's improbable showpiece. A stone cathedral with glass in its windows and bells in its tower, a great tithe barn, byres for 100 cattle, all at the head of a fjord on the rim of the habitable world. The bishops themselves were Norwegians of varying enthusiasm. At least one never sailed out to his diocese at all, but the tithes went home to Rome. Paid, the records show, in walrus ivory, sealskin rope and the odd live falcon. And crusade taxes were assessed on the world's last parish like any other. Even at the planet's edge, the paperwork found you. It is one of the most human facts in the whole story. For now, though, the frontier had energy to spare, and in the year 986, while Eric's fleet was still finding his fjords, a merchant skipper named Bjarni Herjolfsson, sailing from Iceland to join his father in the new colony, was caught in fog and north winds, driven blind across the sea for days. And when the weather lifted, saw a coastline that answered no description he had been given. Low, forested, no glaciers. He did not land. His crew wanted to. Bjarni, with a punctuality history has never forgiven, said his business was in Greenland, turned north along the strange coast, past more wooded shores, and a final rocky, icy one, and duly delivered his cargo. He had almost certainly just seen North America, the first European we can name to do so, and he saw it the way a commuter sees a landmark from the train. In Greenland, men thought little of it at the time, the saga notes, but they remembered the bearings. It was Eric's son who bought Bjarni's ship, and Bjarni's directions. How anyone found anything twice in that ocean deserves its moment of respect. The sagas preserve the actual sailing directions, and they read like recited memory because they were. From this Norwegian headland, sail due west, keeping far enough north of Shetland that you sight it only if visibility is good, far enough south of the Faroes that the sea shows halfway up their cliffs. So many days on, you will meet the birds and whales off Iceland. Latitude was held by eye and habit, the pole star's familiar height, the noon suns, with, per later Icelandic sources, a notched bearing dial as the only instrument, and perhaps, per one enigmatic saga mention, a solar stein, a sunstone of crystal for finding the hidden sun through cloud. Modern optics has shown certain Iceland spar crystals can genuinely do it, though whether sailors truly use them, the evidence stays tantalizingly thin. Mostly it was the accumulated ocean sense this series met on the whale roads of episode 1, now stretched across 2,000 miles of open Atlantic, and equal to it. Leif Erikson was everything the saga tradition wanted in a hero. Big, capable, lucky. That would become his byname, Leif the Lucky, and positioned as the founder's son to lead the colony's next reach. Around the year 1000, he ran Bjarni's route in reverse with a crew of 35. First landfall, the rocky, icy coast, a slab of stone between glacier and sea, which he named Helluland, Flatstone Land, probably Baffin Island. Then south to a low forested shore with white sand beaches, Markland Forest Land, almost certainly Labrador, and to timber-starved Greenlanders, a discovery worth the whole voyage by itself. Then on, 2 more days at sea, to the place that made the legend, an island-sheltered coast where they wintered in comfort, salmon bigger than any they had seen, mild weather, grass that barely withered, and where, in the saga's most argued over scene, Leif's German foster father, Tyrkir, came back from an evening's wandering, talking excitedly in his own language. Then in Norse, he had found grapes, wild grapes, which he knew, being from vine country, as no Norseman would. Leif named the land for them Vinland, Wineland. Where exactly Vinland's grapes grew, real grapes will not grow in Newfoundland, is a puzzle we will pick up shortly. with a shovel. The expedition wintered, cut timber, loaded grapes or something, and sailed home, where Leif promptly demonstrated the other half of his luck by rescuing a shipwrecked crew off a reef along the way, cargo and all. He never went back to Vinland. His father Eric was dying. The colony needed its chief, and Leif the Lucky spent the rest of his story as a settled great man of Greenland, the discoverer in the North's memory of a land he visited exactly once. Those who followed him found Vinland less gentle. His brother Thorvald took the same ship west, explored further, and met what the sagas call, with an ugliness the modern ear must be warned of, Skraelings, the Norse name, likely meaning something like wretches or screechers, for the native peoples of the western lands. First contact, in the saga's telling, was a massacre begun by the Norse. 9 men found, sleeping under skin boats, 8 killed, answered within days by a swarm of boats and arrows. Thorvald, the only Norse casualty, pulled an arrow from his own body, observed with saga-perfect dryness that there was fat around his belly and it had found it, and died. The first European, so far as record reaches, to be killed in the Americas, and among the first buried there. His crew brought the news home. The next expedition would be different. Not a raid, not a reconnaissance, a colony. The colony's leaders are the couple this episode has been quietly waiting for, an Icelandic merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni and his wife Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir. And if the age has a female protagonist to set beside its warrior queens, it is Gudrid. The sagas track her from an Icelandic childhood through shipwreck on the Greenland crossing, widowhood, remarriage into Eric's family, widowhood again, misfortune after misfortune met with level-headed grace, until Karlsefni, wintering in Greenland with trade goods, married her and let her talk him. The sagas hint it was substantially her idea. Into the great venture, Vinland to stay. They sailed with 2 or 3 ships, 60 men and 5 women by one account, livestock lowing in the holds, a farming colony aimed at the meadows Leif had praised. For a year or 3, the 2 sagas disagree, as sagas do. It worked. They wintered at Leif's old camp or near it. The cattle throve, and Gudrid gave birth to a son, Snorri Karlsefnisson, the first European child born in the Americas, 500 years, almost to the decade before the next. Trade opened with the Skraelings, and the saga's picture of it is fascinating and sad at once. The local people, ancestors most likely, of the Innu or Beothuk or their kin, brought splendid furs and wanted in return the 2 things the Norse would not or could not sell, weapons and the stranger's red cloth, which they bought strip by narrowing strip, and milk, in one telling, the colony's dairy, being to them a marvel. Between the trading came shocks. A bellowing bull stampeding out of the Norse camp and scattering a trade meeting in terror, misunderstandings multiplying with no shared language. Then a theft, a killing, and at last an attack in force. Driven off, the saga says, when Freydis. Eric's fierce daughter, heavily pregnant and unable to run, turned on the pursuers and beat a sword against her own bared breast with such fury that the attackers broke. The saga's other Freydis story is far darker. A Vinland partnership ending in her ordering a massacre of her own partners. And scholars trust neither tale entirely. She stands in the tradition as its unresolved shadow. Little Snorri, the colony's one native-born Norseman, lived out the quieter destiny his birthplace was denied. He grew up an Icelandic farmer, built, tradition says, one of the district's first churches, and became an ancestor of note. The sagas take care to record that from Gudrid and Karlsefni's line came 3 of Iceland's early bishops, the genealogists of later centuries. And Iceland keeps genealogies the way other nations keep gold reserves, have traced streams of descendants from the Vinland baby down the generations since. It is a pleasing arithmetic for the edge of sleep. Somewhere in the world tonight, by the slow multiplication of 1,000 years, walk a great many people whose family tree begins with a birth in America, 5 centuries before Columbus. The colonists drew the obvious conclusion, like the traders they were. The land was rich beyond argument. Timber, fish, grazing, grapes somewhere south. But it was already owned by peoples numerous, capable and increasingly hostile. And every replacement axe head, every reinforcement lay a long ocean and a poor colony away. Fair though the land was, the saga has Karlsefni's company conclude, there would always be war and terror overhanging them. They loaded the timber, the furs and the baby, and sailed home. The Norse Atlantic had found its far limit, not at a coastline, but at a balance sheet. Gudrid's story, though, was not half done, and its ending outshines Vinland. Widowed once more in Iceland, prosperous, her son's farm thriving, she took the road one last time, a pilgrimage, on foot, says the saga, staff in hand, south across Europe to Rome, where one imagines the courteous incomprehension as the tall old northern woman explained where she had buried husbands and borne a son. Then home, to end her days as an anchoress beside her son's church. Iceland's tradition calls her Gudrid the far-travelled. Measure her journeys on a globe, Arctic Greenland to the Tiber, Vinland to Rome, and she may be the most widely travelled woman of the entire Middle Ages, from the newest world to the oldest in one lifetime, and the saga's most quietly modern heroine. One line in the records suggests the western runs never entirely stopped. An Icelandic annal for the year 1347, 3.5 centuries after Leif, notes in passing the arrival of a small Greenland ship, storm-driven to Iceland with her anchor lost, that had been on a voyage to Markland. No explanation, none needed apparently. Labrador timber, it seems, was still worth the crossing to tree-starved Greenlanders whenever a ship could be spared. The saga's far coast quietly demoted over the centuries from New World to lumber yard. It is the last written glimpse of Norse America. Not a hero's landfall, but a working boat, blown off course on an errand. So routine, the annalist spent 11 words on it. The Vinland Hunger even produced a famous modern casualty. In 1965, Yale University unveiled the so-called Vinland Map, a worn parchment world map, allegedly from before Columbus, showing a great island in the west, labelled Vinelanda Insula. It made global headlines. It also, over the following decades, failed nearly every scientific test applied to it, the ink betraying modern chemistry, until Yale itself formally pronounced it a forgery, a 20th century fake drawn onto genuinely old parchment. The episode is a cautionary footnote this series takes to heart. The age is romantic enough that people will manufacture evidence for it, which makes the real thing, found 5 years before the map was unveiled, all the sweeter. For 8 centuries afterward, Vinland lived only in parchment. 2 sagas that contradict each other on names, dates and geography, plus a stray mention by a German chronicler within living memory of the voyages. noting matter-of-factly that the Danish king had told him of an Atlantic island where vines grew. Enlightenment scholars mapped conjectures. Enthusiasts planted Norse ghosts from Maine to Minnesota. Forgers obliged with fake runestones. And serious history filed the whole matter, reasonably under unprovable. Then in 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his wife, the archaeologist Anne Steen Ingstad, worked the coasts of Newfoundland, asking fishermen a simple question. Any old ruins hereabouts? At the island's very northern tip, at a hamlet called Lanceau Meadows, a local man led them to what everyone called the old Indian camp. Grassed over ridges by a brook, 7 seasons of excavation turned the ridges into history. The unmistakable footprints of Norse turf halls built exactly as in Iceland and Greenland. A bronze cloak pin, a spindle whirl of soapstone, a woman's tool confirming the saga's women, a stone oil lamp, iron boat rivets, and the clincher, a smithy with slag and a furnace where bog iron had been worked, a technology no native people of the region used. Radiocarbons said around the year 1000. Recently, scientists dating tree rings cut by metal tools have pinned one season of Norse activity there to the exact year 1021. The sagas, it turned out, had been telling a true story all along. Embroidered, disputed, but true. Lanceau Meadows itself was likely not the sweet Vinland of grapes. No vines grow so far north. It has the look of the Enterprise's gateway, a ship repair and wintering station at the entrance to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, from which crews probed further south. The ground even hints at those probes. Among the debris lay butternuts, a species whose nearest trees grow hundreds of miles southwest, in exactly the country where wild grapes also grow. Somewhere down there, some summer around the turn of the millennium, a Norse crew stood in a hardwood forest heavy with vines and nuts. They left, so far as we yet know, nothing behind but the story. Archaeologists are still looking. It is one of the pleasant thoughts this series can offer you at the edge of sleep. The next Vinland site is out there somewhere, under a meadow, waiting for its brook and its curious local. And Greenland, the colony that launched it all. Its ending is one of history's quiet mysteries and deserves a gentle telling. For centuries the fjord farms endured. Then in the 1300s, the world turned against them by degrees. The climate cooled, the long chill historians call the Little Ice Age, choking the sailing routes with ice and shortening the hay harvests that kept the cattle alive. Europe's ivory market collapsed as elephant tusk flooded in through new trade routes. The royal ship from Norway came seldom, then never. The Western settlement fell silent first. A visitor around 1350 found farms standing empty, cattle gone wild, and no one, Norse or otherwise, to say what had happened. The Eastern settlement held on generations longer. The last certain document of Norse Greenland is a wedding. September 1408 at Valsey Church, whose stone shell still stands roofless above the fjord. A couple married before witnesses. The record duly copied in Iceland, where the newlyweds later settled. After that, nothing. No massacre in the record, no exodus, no final letter. The world's farthest parish simply faded from the world's attention. And when ships next came curious, centuries on, only the ruins and the Inuit, who had thrived where the farmers starved and whose traditions kept some memory of the strangers, remained to be asked. The Greenlanders were not, in their last centuries, alone up there, and the meetings the sagas barely mention archaeology has begun to recover. As the Norse clung to the fjords, the Thule people, ancestors of today's Inuit, master sea mammal hunters spreading east from Alaska, arrived along the very hunting coasts the farmers depended on. Norse smelted iron and chainmail rings, bronze scraps and woolen cloth turn up in Thule sites far up the coast. A small driftwood carving from an Inuit settlement seems to show unmistakably a figure in European dress. Trade, salvage, avoidance, skirmish. The evidence whispers all of these, and Inuit oral tradition kept stories of the Kavla night, the strangers long after the farms emptied. Two peoples shared the great island's dusk. The one built for the Arctic inherited it. There is one last gentle scene in the Greenland story. In 1721, a Norwegian missionary named Hans Egede sailed for Greenland on an errand of pastoral rescue. The colony, Scandinavia knew, had been out of contact for centuries, and Egede meant to find the lost Norse congregations and bring them, poor cut-off souls, the Reformation. He searched the fjords and found the churches. Roofless, turf swallowed, 3 centuries silent. Of his lost flock, nothing but stones. He stayed and preached instead to the Inuit. And modern Greenland dates its European chapter from his mission. But the image endures as the true end of the westward Vikings. A pastor with a Bible standing in the grass-grown door of Valsey Church, calling on parishioners who had been gone 300 years. 500 years after Bjarne's fog-bound sighting, another sailor would raise the far shore of the Atlantic, with a continent's weight of consequence. The Norse reach for America changed. By most measures, nothing. No exchange, no conquest, no maize in Norway. And yet it stands in this series as something almost more precious. Proof of the sheer range of the age. That the same world which sent axemen to Constantinople's throne room and law speakers to a lava plain also sent a farm family with a cradle across the whole Atlantic 1,000 years ago. The ocean was crossable all along. History, for once, simply declined to notice. Next time, our finale. The age gathers for its last great throw. A giant out of the Varangian Guard takes the crown of Norway and stakes it on England. 3 armies race through one impossible September, and at a bridge in Yorkshire and a hill near Hastings, inside 3 weeks, the Viking Age ends twice. That is where we will leave it tonight. Sleep well wherever you are, and when you're ready, we'll go wandering again. Good evening and welcome back. Settle in. Lower the lights if you'd like. There is nothing here you need to do tonight. Only listen and let the world grow quiet around you. It is the morning of the 25th of September, 1066, and the most experienced warrior in the world is enjoying the sunshine. He is 51 years old and stands, by every account, head and shoulders above other men. He has fought from the Norwegian snows to the sands of Sicily. He has commanded the palace guard of Constantinople, seen an emperor blinded, escaped a Byzantine prison, carried home the wealth of the East, and worn the crown of Norway for 20 years. His name is Harald Sigurdsson, called Hardrada, Hard Counsel, the Hard Ruler. And 5 days ago, he shattered an English army and received the surrender of York. Today is administrative, a warm autumn day, a hostage exchange at a river crossing east of the city. It is so hot and the war so nearly won. that he has told a third of his army to stay with the ships, and the rest have left their mail shirts behind. Then on the road from York, a cloud of dust, and beneath it, points of light, like a field of broken ice, the saga says, glittering. An army is coming, the wrong army. An army that should be 250 miles to the south and is instead an hour away and moving fast. The Viking Age has ended in many places at many times in this series, but if it ended on a single day, this is the day. Tonight, the last Viking, the full, impossible life of Harald Hardrada, and the 3-week September that closed the age. Begin 36 years earlier with a 15-year-old bleeding in a Norwegian forest. Harald was a king's half-brother in an age when that was a dangerous relation. Olaf Haraldsson, King Olaf the Stout, as his contemporaries knew him, Saint Olaf, as all Scandinavia would soon know him, had spent a decade forcing Christianity and a single crown onto Norway's quarrelsome chieftains until his enemies and the Danish king drove him into exile in the east. In 1030 he came back over the mountains with a scratch army to reclaim his kingdom, and his teenage half-brother marched with him. Over the protests, tradition says, of everyone sensible. At Stiklestad, north of Trondheim, the peasant levies of Norway met their once and future saint. The men Olaf had bullied toward heaven, arrayed against him in their thousands. The battle was fought under a strange darkness that chroniclers would later link to an eclipse. The king went down beneath 3 great wounds, and his army broke. Harald, 15, took a wound and would have died on the field but for a stubborn companion who dragged him away, hid him at a remote farm, and smuggled him east over the mountains when he could ride. In the sagas, Harald composes his first surviving verse on that ride. Rye already. Now the forest must shelter him, who yesterday marched with a king. And who knows, it ends. My name may yet be wide enough in the world. The dead king's afterlife deserves its paragraph because all Norway's politics and Harald's own legitimacy would grow from that grave. Olaf's body, buried secretly in sandy ground by the Nidelva River, was exhumed a year later before witnesses. Incorrupt, the clergy declared, hair and nails still growing, and the bishop enshrined him at once. Miracles multiplied. The Danish puppet regime his enemies had installed collapsed within 5 years under the weight of its own unpopularity and the martyr's memory, and the shrine at Nidaros, Trondheim, grew into the great pilgrimage church of the north, with Olaf proclaimed, in a phrase that entered Norwegian law, the country's eternal king. Every later claimant, Harald included, would rule in some sense as the saint's deputy. The Viking Age had produced many royal corpses. This was the first one that kept working after death. Note the pattern set at Stiklestad, because it will hold for 36 years. Total defeat refused as a conclusion. And note what happened to the dead king, because it changed the north. Within a year, miracle stories were gathering around Olaf's grave. Within a generation, the church had made him a saint, and Norway had made him its eternal king, the violent half-pagan country's own royal martyr. The Viking Age's gods, we will find at this story's end, did not go down fighting. They were, so to speak, promoted out of existence. And the process was already underway, as the future last Viking limped east into exile. Harald's road east was the road our 3rd episode paved, down the river roads of the Rus to the court of Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev, where an exiled Norse princeling with a sword was a familiar and useful commodity. He fought some years in Yaroslav's service and conceived an ambition above his station, the Grand Prince's daughter, Elisaveta. The verses he addressed to her, some of the few Norse love poems with a named author and object, run on a rueful refrain. He has done this and that deed of note across the world, and yet a goddess of the gold rings in Gardarich disdains me. He was, for the moment, a landless teenager with a famous dead brother. Yaroslav, dinners to his fingertips, declined, but kept the door open. Fortunes, after all, could change. And Constantinople, where fortunes changed fastest, lay at the river road's end. So Harald went to Miklagard and joined the Varangian Guard, and rose within a few years to command it. The Byzantine sources wonderfully confirm him. A manual of imperial advice, written a generation later, cites Araltes, brother of the King of Norway, who came with 500 warriors, served loyally in Sicily and Bulgaria, and was honoured with court titles. A foreign prince who did not complain, the author marvels, at earning his rank. The sagas, characteristically, prefer the deeds and the loot, campaigns against Arab corsairs, and through the towns of Sicily under the great general Georgios Maniakes, with whom Harold's relations were, the tradition insists, poisonous. Tricks and stratagems by the dozen, including the old fable of taking a town by feigning his own death and being carried through the gates in a coffin. And 18 major engagements worth of plunder, shipped north batch by batch to Yaroslav's safekeeping, the medieval world's most reliable offshore account. The sagas garland the Sicilian years with stratagems. 4 separate towns taken by 4 separate tricks, including one captured by sparrows sent home under fire shavings, a tale you will remember from Olga of Kiev 2 episodes ago. The fable migrated wherever a cunning commander needed dressing. More historically nourishing are the verses. Harald composed throughout his life, and 16 of his stanzas survive under the charming title of the Gammon Visur, the joking verses. Each one listing his accomplishments: fighting, riding, swimming, skiing, shooting, rowing, harp playing and poetry in one famous catalogue. And each ending on the same rueful hook: we met in Kiev, and still the goddess of the gold rings in Russia disdains me. A future king of Norway, drafting and redrafting a poetic cover letter for a princess in barracks from Sicily to the Bosphorus. The Middle Ages offer few more human documents. His Byzantine exit was the wildest chapter of all, and here even sober historians lean in. In 1042, the young Emperor Michael V overthrew the Empress Zoe, adoptive mother, co-ruler, and the dynasty's living legitimacy. And the city rose against him in one of Constantinople's periodic volcanic riots. The mob and the palace factions won. The deposed emperor was dragged from sanctuary, and his eyes were put out. A Byzantine mercy, disqualifying rather than killing. The Norse tradition is unanimous and specific. The Varangians did the blinding, and Harald led them. His poets boasted of it for the rest of his life. The king who left an emperor eyeless, shortly afterward accused variously of misappropriating imperial plunder or presuming toward a princess, Harald was imprisoned and escaped, the saga says, when a pious lady, prompted by Saint Olaf in a dream, lowered ropes into the cell. He roused his Varangians, seized 2 galleys, and rowed for the harbour chain, the great iron boom across the Golden Horn. His trick has delighted naval historians ever since. Full speed at the chain, all hands and cargo aft to lift the bows. Then, as the ships rode up onto the iron, everyone scrambling forward to seesaw them over. One galley broke its back and spilled its crew. Harold's tipped over the chain and away up the Bosphorus into the Black Sea night, with the fortune of the East aboard and Kiev ahead. Yaroslav, presented with the returning hero now floating on Byzantine gold, reconsidered. Harold and Elisaveta were married that winter. Whatever else the age offers, it has no better arc of persistence. The disdained exile came back for his princess with an emperor's ransom and the guard's back pay. 15 years, one poem, kept like an invoice. The homecoming negotiation itself became one of the saga's set-piece scenes. Uncle and nephew met aboard ship, and Harold had his Byzantine treasure carried out and poured across an ox hide on the deck. Gold in quantities, the saga swears, that no man in the northern lands had seen in one place before. Magnus, in answer, could offer only what a young king of two poor countries had, a single gold arm ring, and the observation, made gently by a ruler wondering aloud, that it was strange for the uncle to have all the gold and the nephew all the land. The exchange, whether it happened in those words or only should have, is the whole 11th century North in one image, the old world's wealth measured in rings, the new world's in kingdoms, and Harold, who intended to hold both, counting out his purchase price on an ox hide. Harold came home to Norway in 1045, rich enough to buy a war and connected enough not to need one. Quite. His nephew Magnus, Saint Olaf's son, now ruled Norway and Denmark both. Confronted by an uncle with limitless silver and a Kievan alliance, he cut the deal the age's politics demanded, half of Norway now, in exchange for half of Harold's treasure. 2 years later, Magnus died young, after naming, with tidy inconvenience, 2 heirs, Norway to Harold, and Denmark to the Danish claimant, Svein Estridsson. Harold took the Norwegian half and spent nearly 2 decades trying to collect the other, in a grinding annual war of coastal burnings. Hedeby, the North's great market town, went up in flames that the Skald watched from the harbour. And indecisive fleet battles, until even Harold conceded the pointlessness, made peace and looked for a worthier prize. The Danish War did produce one night the Skalds never let go of, the sea battle at the Nissø River mouth in 1062, fought almost uniquely in the age's records, in darkness, fleet lashed to fleet in the old style, fighting across the gunwales by starlight until past midnight, when Sweyn's line broke and 70 Danish ships drifted empty. Sweyn himself escaped. He always escaped. His talent for losing battles and keeping his kingdom exhausted stronger men than Harold. And the war sputtered out in mutual weariness. But for one August night, the last generation of the longship age fought the kind of battle their great-grandfathers would have recognised, prow to prow in the dark, and the poets aboard took notes. At home, meanwhile, he earned the byname. Hardrada, hard counsel, the hard ruler, was not a compliment, and the sagas do not soften him. Chieftains who resisted the crown's reach were burned out or broken. Regional assemblies that defied him learned better. His court poets, whom he collected and judged with the professional's ear, he was, everyone agreed, a fine poet himself, celebrated a king whose word was iron either way, in gift or in vengeance. He founded a trading town in a sheltered bay that would grow into Oslo. He pushed the church, minted coin, hardened the state his brother the saint had sketched. Norway under Harald was what the whole north was becoming. A European kingdom, centralised, Christian, taxed, built by the most Viking figure alive. The age was ending in his own hands, and one suspects he half knew it. The raider's world of open doors was gone, closed by exactly such kings as himself. For a man of his appetites, only one door of the old size remained anywhere in the north. England. How hard Harald's rule could cut. One killing shows. Einar Tambuskelfir, Paunch Shaker, the great bowman of the old wars, now the mightiest chieftain of the Trondheim country and self-appointed keeper of St. Olaf's legacy, made himself the crown's chief obstruction, packing assemblies and springing accused men from the king's own courts. Summoned with his son to talk terms in the royal hall, Einar walked into darkness, the hall's lights doused, and father and son were cut down at the threshold by the king's men. It was murder at a parley, medieval politics at its barest. The countryside seethed and settled because there was no one left of Einar's size to lead it. Hard counsel, the byname said. Norway had gotten precisely the state building its neighbours had, a knife's width less gently. In the first week of 1066, Edward the Confessor, England's pious, childless old king, died at Westminster and the door swung wide. England was the jewel of the north, rich beyond any Scandinavian kingdom, administratively precocious and dynastically a tangle, having spent the century passing between English and Danish kings. For England too had its Viking Age climax within living memory. Not the Great, the Danish conqueror who had ruled England, Denmark and Norway as one North Sea empire, dead only 30 years. Every strong man around the sea could construct a claim. The English council crowned the obvious one, Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, no royal blood, but the kingdom's chief soldier and statesman on the spot. Across the Channel, Duke William of Normandy declared the throne promised to him, and Harold his forsworn vassal, and began building ships. And in Norway, Harald Hardrada dusted off the thinnest claim of the three. A treaty said to have been sworn a generation earlier between his nephew Magnus and England's then king, each to inherit if the other died heirless, which by aggressive arithmetic made England his. Thin claims need thick allies, and Harold's arrived embittered and well informed. Tostig Godwinson, the new English king's own brother, lately Earl of Northumbria until his earldom rose against his harsh rule, and his brother, choosing peace over family, let him fall. Tostig had spent the exile since shopping for a patron against his brother. In Norway, the sagas have him flatter the old lion expertly. Tostig, for his part, had already spent the spring failing on his own account. With the fleet scraped together in Flanders, he had raided the south coast, been chased north, tried a landing in Lincolnshire, where the local earls broke his force so thoroughly that his fleet deserted him, and limped to Scotland with a dozen ships to wait out the summer as the Scots king's guest. It matters for what followed. By the time he stood at Harold's elbow, Tostig was not a partner bringing an army. He was a beggar bringing a map, a claim to legitimacy in the north, and an exile's certainty, fatal, infectious, that England would rise to welcome them. Advisors with everything to regain and nothing left to lose have sunk more fleets than weather. That summer, Harold staked everything. A fleet the sources call 300 ships, the levies of Norway, his household, his banner. A white silk standard named Landwaster, which he held luck itself, down to Shetland and Orkney, gathering strength, then south onto the Yorkshire coast, burning as tradition required. On the 20th of September, at Fulford outside York, the Earls of the English North met him with their levies and were broken in a marsh. A real, bloody, full-scale battle that history barely remembers because of what the next 5 days did to it. York opened its gates. Hostages were arranged from the Shire to be delivered a few days on, at a crossing east of the city where roads met, Stamford Bridge. The sagas send the fleet off under a freight of omens, and whatever their historicity, they are the tradition's own verdict, composed with hindsight's full knowledge. One man dreams of a great troll woman standing before the fleet with a carrion knife and trough, chanting that she sensed the king's doom. Another sees the ship's prows crowded with ravens and eagles, and a she-wolf on every headland fed before the fleet sails. Harald himself, in the darkest of the dreams, meets his dead brother, the Saint, who warns him plainly that death waits in the west. Troll-ridden England, the phrase runs, is not for him. The historical Harald, of course, sailed anyway. The Harald of the sagas sails anyway too, which is the point. The North told this story afterward the way the Greeks told of heroes. The doom visible, the greatness in going regardless. What Harald did not know, what no commander of the age would have believed, was what the other Harald was doing. Harald Godwinson had spent the summer watching the Channel for William, his real fear. When the North exploded, his southern army had just stood down, its provisions exhausted. He remustered it and marched it north, London to Yorkshire, some 185 miles in roughly 5 days, gathering shire levies as he came. One of the great forced marches of medieval history, an army moving at the speed of rumour. On the evening of the 24th, he was in Tadcaster. York spared occupation, quietly let him through at dawn. The Norwegians at Stamford Bridge, sunning themselves among the hostage cattle with their mail 7 miles away at the ships, looked up on the morning of the 25th and saw the dust. Weather, it should be said, was the invisible player in the whole Triple campaign, and it played to the end for William. All summer, the Norman invasion fleet had sat windbound in its river mouths, while Harold's English army watched the coast. It was that same stubborn northerly, foul for Normandy, fair for Norway, that carried Hardrada across from the Orkneys, forced Harald to march his weary levies north instead, and then, with timing no dramatist would dare, swung round to the south in the very days after Stamford Bridge, releasing William onto an undefended coast, while England's army stood victorious, exhausted, and 250 miles out of position. Historians rightly resist explaining 1066 by luck alone, but no honest account of it leaves out the wind. The saga gives the day a last parley, and whether or not the words were ever spoken, the North treasured them too much for this episode to omit. 20 horsemen ride out from the English lines. Their leader calls for Tostig and offers him, from his brother the king, peace, pardon, and his earldom back. And for Harald of Norway, Tostig asks, "What will you give?" The rider answers, 7 feet of English ground, or as much more as he is taller than other men. The horsemen turn back. Harald, watching, asks who spoke so well. Tostig replies, that was Harald Godwinson himself. The last Viking's recorded response is professional admiration. A little man, he says, but he stood proudly in his stirrups. Fulford, 5 days earlier, had been won by veteran patience. The young English earls, Edwin and Morcar, had drawn up with the river on one flank and Marsh on the other and attacked the Norwegian line at its weakest end. And Harold had let that wing bend backward, absorbing the push at his rawest troops until the English advance had stretched itself along the front. Then Landwaster came forward at the strong end, and the whole veteran mass wheeled through the hinge. The English pressed into the marsh, died in numbers, the chroniclers measured with a dreadful image, the causeway of bodies over which they said the Norwegians could cross dry-shod. It was a masterclass, the last great set-piece victory of the Viking Age, and its completeness is half the explanation for Stamford Bridge. An army that has just annihilated the Norse levies, taken the Norse capital, and dictated terms does not easily imagine, 5 days later, that anything is left in England to surprise it. The battle that followed was long, chaotic, and, for the Norwegians, catastrophic, and its stages come down to us in fragments English and Norse. The English tradition kept the bridge itself, a single giant, Norse axeman, holding the narrow crossing alone, while the army scrambled to form up beyond. 40 English dead by his hand, says one account, until a soldier drifted under the bridge in a swill tub and speared him from below through the planks. The Norse tradition kept its king, Harald in the shield wall's front in his blue tunic, fight and bear of mail in the heat, his hauberk, which he had named Emma, folded uselessly at Rickle with the ships, until an arrow took him through the throat, and the man who had survived Stiklestad, Sicily, the palace revolutions of Byzantium, and 20 years of Baltic War went down on a Yorkshire riverbank with his ambition an hour wide. Landwaster passed to Tostig, who refused the quarter his brother, the sources suggest, offered even then, and died under his own choice. Late in the day, the men from the ships arrived at a dead run in their mail. Ori's storm, the Norse called that last charge, for the captain who led it, fought to astonishment and broke in their turn. Between the bridge's fall and the day's end came the phases the traditions half preserve. The Norwegian shield ring on the rising ground, Landwaster at its centre, holding through assault after assault under the September sun. The saga's controversial English cavalry, perhaps a memory of mounted household troops, perhaps a Norse storyteller dressing the battle in Hastings clothes, breaking against the spears and wheeling away. Harold's last fury, both hands on his sword, out ahead of the wall where no armour was anyway. And after the arrow found him, the strange hours pause in the slaughter, almost a truce, while the armies drew breath around his body, before Tostig took up the banner and refused the final offer, and the storm of Ori's ship companies arrived, magnificent and useless, to die with the rest. The saga gives the day its epitaph in Harold's own manner, a verse he supposedly spoke that morning, then rejected as poor work and recomposed better. We never kneel in battle before the storm of weapons. So commanded the word true woman of the Hawk's high land. Even his last poem got an edit. It was that kind of mind. The numbers tell the ending better than any scene. The fleet that came to England, the Chronicle says, filled 300 ships. The survivors granted peace by an exhausted victor who marched them to the coast under oath never to return, needed 24 to carry them home. Among those spared, Harold's son Olaf, who would rule Norway long and so peacefully that history calls him Olaf the Quiet. The age's ambitions in England were not merely defeated at Stamford Bridge, they were extinguished in an afternoon at a ratio the North could neither replace nor forget. The peace granted at Rickhall had its own quiet dignities. Among those spared, besides the Prince Olaf, were the Earl of Orkney and the young men of a dozen island families. The wounded were suffered to be gathered, and the oath exacted, friendship and no return in arms, was remarkably kept. No Norwegian royal fleet ever again sailed against England. The dead of Stamford Bridge were left to the ravens the omens had promised, and the English buried them at their leisure. Travellers reported the whitening bones on the field for a generation. As for the Hard King himself, England held him only briefly. A year later, his son was permitted to carry the body home, where it was buried in the church Harald himself had raised in Trondheim, and later moved as churches rose and fell. His grave today is uncertain, somewhere, most likely, under a paved street of the city, which the old Varangian, who had slept in stranger places, might have found fitting enough. Even the arithmetic of the disaster was remembered in ships. 300 sails had come over from Norway that autumn, the chronicles agree. When Olaf gathered the survivors at Rickhall and the English let them go, 24 ships sufficed to carry every man still living home. Whole districts of western Norway, the sagas say, had no grown men come back at all. The levy rolls of a generation had gone into the Ouse and the meadow by the Derwent. Norway did not fight another aggressive war for a lifetime, not because her kings grew gentle, but because the country needed 30 years simply to grow the men. Harold Godwinson had 3 days to feel like the saviour of England. Then a rider from the south, the wind in the channel had turned, and William of Normandy was ashore in Sussex, building a castle. The exhausted royal army about faced, and marched the length of England a second time. On the 14th of October, on a hill near Hastings, it formed its shield wall once more. The same wall that had broken the Norwegians, thin now by them, and held it against the Norman cavalry from morning until dusk, when the arrows and the feigned retreats finally opened it, and Harold fell beneath his standards with his brothers and his housecarls around him. 3 kings had contested the year. By nightfall on the 14th of October, 2 were dead, and the 3rd was William the Conqueror. England's year had one more scene of grim theatre in it. William was crowned at Westminster on Christmas Day, 1066, and even the coronation went to the age's dark rhythm. When the congregation inside roared its acclamation in 2 languages, the Norman guards outside took the noise for an uprising and began setting fire to the neighbouring houses. The service finished, chroniclers say, in smoke and half-empty pews. The new king trembling at his own altar while London burned around the abbey. The conquest would go on in that key for years, rebellion and castle, harrying and Domesday ledger. But that is another country story now, and other evenings. And here the series' last irony asks to be unfolded gently, because it is perfect. Who were these Normans, the men whose conquest ended English resistance and closed our story's frame? The name says it plainly, Northmen. 150 years earlier, a Viking warlord named Rollo, a raider of the Seine out of the same world as every fleet in this series, had been bought off by a Frankish king with the old desperate coin, land at the river mouth, baptism and a title, on condition he keep other Vikings out. His descendants had traded longships for war horses and Norse for French inside 3 generations, becoming the most formidably organised warrior aristocracy in Europe. But the Duke who won Hastings was Rollo's great-great-great-grandson. In the year 1066, England was invaded twice by 2 branches of the same Norse expansion, the one that had stayed Viking and the one that had evolved. The old model died at Stamford Bridge. The new one took the kingdom 19 days later, and from it in time would come the England whose language and law and restlessness spread across the world. The Viking Age did not exactly end in 1066. It won, wearing a different helmet. A word, finally, on how we know any of tonight, because the debt is specific. The scenes of Harald's life come principally through Snorri Sturluson's Great Chronicle of Norway's Kings, written in Iceland around 1230, 160 years after Stamford Bridge. From older written lives, now mostly lost, and above all from the skaldic verses composed by eyewitness court poets, which Snorri quotes like footnotes. His method was startlingly modern. Verse, he explains in his preface, is evidence, because a poem recited before the king and his men could not lie about deeds they had all seen. Flattery, yes. Invention, no. Between the poem's bedrock and Snorri's narrative bridging, the reader must pick a path, and historians have argued over every plank. We have walked it tonight the way this series always does. The verifiable told plainly, the legends told as legends, and the whole of it told with gratitude that a farmer chieftain on a subarctic island thought the memory worth the calfskin. As for the world of the dragon ships itself, it did not so much fall as settle. The 3 Scandinavian crowns hardened into ordinary European kingdoms, their fleets now royal navies, their raiders now taxpayers. The Christianization Olaf died for at Stiklestad completed itself within the century. The old gods fading into folklore, the ship burials into churchyards, though Thor's hammers were still being cast in the same moulds as crosses for a cautious generation or 2. Out on the Atlantic rim, the age lingered longest. Norse earls ruled Orkney for centuries more. The Icelandic Commonwealth argued its law at the Althing until the 1260s. Norse Greenland, as we heard last night, kept its lamps lit into the 1400s. And in Iceland, as the sea roads quieted, the grandchildren of the age did the thing for which this whole series is in their debt. They wrote it all down. Snorri Sturluson, chieftain, politician, and the North's great historian, composing the very saga of Harald, whose scenes we have retold tonight, preserving the kings and the verses, the gods and the ship funerals, on calfskin, on a farm, in the long dark of the northern winter. Hold the whole arc a moment as we close the series. It began on a June morning in 793, with monks watching sails they could not read, and it ends on a September afternoon in 1066, with the Norse army watching English dust it could not believe. The surprise attack from the sea undone at the last by a surprise attack by land. In between, Alfred in his marsh, Ibn Fadlan on his riverbank, Gudrid rocking a cradle in Vinland, Halfdan scratching his name in Hagia Sophia's marble. The fury of the Northmen turned out to be many things the litany never guessed. Merchants and lawgivers, poets and parliament founders, the makers of Russia and Normandy and Iceland's literature, and yes, always the axes. No single ending could hold all of that. But the North itself chose its ending image long ago, and it is the right one. The tallest man of the age, offered exactly 7 feet of English ground and taken it. Harald's body, after a year, was carried home and buried in Trondheim, in church ground by the rites of the White Christ, like the Christian king he also was. The age of the Northmen was over. The world it made, from the Volga to Newfoundland, was just getting started. Thank you for wandering these 5 northern evenings with me, from Lindisfarne Stone to Stamford Bridge, and for every evening of every series before them. That is where we will leave it tonight. Sleep well wherever you are, and when you're ready, we'll go wandering again.